Okay, dear colleagues, welcome to the seminar on temporal materialism with Ádám Takács from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. Ádám Takács is senior lecturer at the Atelier Department of European Social Sciences and Historiography at the already mentioned University in Budapest. He earned his PhD with a dissertation written on Husserl's notion of fundament, Grund, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris in 2009. Since then, he has been equally engaged in a philosophical research dedicated to the question of temporal materialism and in various projects on Foucault, the Annan School, and the history of Marxism. Let me add that there is a long-term friendship between Ádám and our institute. Ádám participated in our conference Phenomenology and Society in 2013. Accordingly, Ádám published a paper in our joint journal Philosophy and Society entitled Intentionality and Objectification, Husserl and Simmel on the Cognitive and Social Conditions for Experience. In the same year, some of us were invited by Ádám to a conference in Budapest entitled Philosophical Approaches to History. And finally, Ádám also participated in our conference in Belgrade in 2015, devoted to liberalisms and anti-liberalisms. And also, there is also an ongoing cooperation between Ádám and myself for a long time, which will continue, I hope so. Okay, dear Ádám, thank you for being with us in Belgrade, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation, and for how you want me to for having the opportunity to discuss with you my current research project. And I'm really happy to be here. Not only it's an honor, and not only it's a continuation of a friendship, my friendship with Mark and Petar and a few other people here, but it's you should know that when you go somewhere, especially in Western Europe, I mean, you may experience yourself. People keep talking about crisis, how philosophy is in crisis and how science is in crisis in general, and moaning about the difficulty of university life. Here in Belgrade, on the contrary, all things I hear is about new projects, new opening, new initiatives, things that you are doing, 5 hours research seminars with Gabor Boros in the last time. So it's kind of a different spirit here, and I enjoy it. I enjoy it very much. So the task I've given myself in accordance with Mark is that I held here an introductory lecture to the text that I was distributed. And with this text, I'm going to address the larger context of the problematics I'm dealing with under the label temporal materialism. And you can read the title already. My approach, my leading thread through this contextualization of the problematic I'm interested in will be the notion of phenomenology, materiality, and the challenge of realism. And this is important for me because I'm coming from the phenomenological tradition, very much unsatisfied. I've been working myself into phenomenology through like 20 years, and now I'm working myself out of it in a way towards realism. And I find it's maybe more difficult to work yourself out phenomenology than working yourself into phenomenology. But I'm still using it. I'm still keeping an eye on phenomenology, and I think it's useful. But I obviously see the certain limits of it, and I want to discuss where do I see the limits of phenomenology, the advantage and disadvantage of phenomenological approach to reality. In doing so, obviously, I'm going to address to a certain extent the question of new realism or object-oriented ontologies as they pose a challenge to phenomenology these days. Not because my project necessarily requires a confrontation with new realism. I don't really do that, but I know obviously that there are points of contact between the two approaches, and probably you would have asked the question, what's my relationship to new realism in a project that seeks to address the question of reality. So that's the basic problematic around which my roughly 30 minutes of presentation is wrapped up. And then I'm hoping to be able to get to the point at the end of this talk where my text that had been distributed begins with the question of temporality, historicity, and the notion of reality. So let me put very abruptly the fact for a kickoff that phenomenology today is maybe facing challenges in a more radical way that it has used to face challenges in its past 100 years history. These challenges appear not only in the way of cognitive sciences, digital technologies, which really kind of forces phenomenology to reconsider his philosophical realm, but as you all know, maybe the major challenge today in philosophy is that what we call the appearance, emergence of realist trends on the contemporary continental philosophical scene. I don't want to get into details of what does it mean, new realism, or I just indicate that I assume you all know what it's all about. If not, we can get back to the discussion. But there are some major thinkers like Quentin Meillassoux, Graham Harman, Maurizio Ferraris, Marcus Gabriel, Jocelyn Benoit, who can be labeled as belonging to new realism, new materialism, speculative realism, or object-oriented ontologies. And their works, no matter how diverse and different may be, have a common point, namely, they all, in one way or another, execute a contemporary critique of phenomenology as a major point of departure of their own philosophical endeavors. Now, this new realism, which consists, to put it very simply, in regaining the sense of reality by metaphysical means and through a strong critique of some of the core ideas of classical and contemporary phenomenological philosophy, I think has basically three different major critical attacks. One of them is putting into question the overarching validity of the a priori correlational relationship between consciousness and object. So the basic Husserlian idea of which the entire phenomenological movement grown up, and I think it still holds valid in most of the phenomenological philosophies, that we have a direct relationship between consciousness and object, whatever we mean by conscious object. This a priori correlational relationship is what defines phenomenological endeavors and make them distinguish from other possible philosophical approaches. Now, Neurialism abruptly questions the validity of correlational relationship between consciousness and object. Therefore, they're also refusing, in the second major point, the transcendental point of view as the basic position from which philosophy should address the question of reality, word, life, consciousness, etc. And they argue, on the contrary, for the validity and ontological sovereignty of the material, natural objects and word, which precisely, by not having a correlational and transcendental relationship consciousness, therefore in their subsistence, lack any subjective grounding and mediation. So that's, I know it's a caricature of Neurialism, but basically these are the points of confrontation with phenomenology, to put it really in a nutshell. Now the question is that, what can we say to this critic from a phenomenological point of view? Do we need to say anything? Is it a true challenge? Do Neurialism really challenge phenomenology on its own level? Or it is just a philosophical mode that will disappear? Or maybe a systematic philosophical approach, like structuralism has been a systematic philosophical approach, but also phenomenology could survive the structuralist attack in the 1960s and 70s. Do we have to take seriously then? That's the question of Neurialism if we want to continue doing phenomenology. And my claim is that yes, we do. We do need to take seriously the Neurialist challenge insofar as phenomenology, through its 100 years of history, has become an almost exclusively subject-oriented philosophical endeavor. So we know everything about a subject in phenomenological terms. I mean, everything: consciousness, unconsciousness, desire, death, embodiment, affectivity, sensibility, touching, everything we know about the subject. But do we know enough about the object from phenomenological point of view? And it seemed to me that phenomenology has very little to offer in its traditional and new versions when it comes to describe the features of the world in its objective, natural, material constitution. So we know everything about the subject, but when it comes to explain what does it mean that I knock on this table and it has a noise, and it has a contact between my hand and this object, why does it have a noise, and what does it mean that it has a noise, and what way does it resist to my body? We have very little theoretical explanation in the contemporary and classical phenomenological theories. What is this experience, knocking on a piece of wood? If you wish, we can put it in that way. Husserl's IDN2 is maybe the last systematic approach in the history of phenomenology to understand what a natural object is. Husserl's idea in Zwei is the last, not the first and the last attempt. There's no continuation in the phenomenological tradition of Husserl's idea in Zwei. They have continuation, idea in 1, obviously, and even idea in 3, too, if you want to put it in Husserlian way. But the question of phenomenological reality, of material nature, objective nature, has not got a tradition in phenomenological thinking. So from this point of view, I think the challenge is right. The challenge that's coming from Jurism, we need to face it. We need to find an answer for appropriate philosophical formulation with regards to the question of objective nature and material reality. Now, can phenomenology, the second question would be precisely, can phenomenology meet this challenge? Can it respond to the challenge of Jurism? And my claim would be, yes, it can, insofar as phenomenology is willing to revisit critically its tradition in the light of the question of the constitution of the reality and materiality of the world. So that's the very general kind of landscape, philosophical landscape, on which my project on the relationship between time and matter is situated. Now, the question obviously will be that, do we need a realist reorientation in phenomenology? And if we do, as I believe it, we do, what does it mean? What does it mean to reconfigure phenomenology in order to be able to respond to the question of reality, realism, and materiality, from which reality, in my view, is, at least its ontological grounding, is inseparable. I will try to respond to this question at the last part of this very presentation. What does it mean, realist phenomenology? What does it mean, realist reorientation phenomenology? But before to get there, let's just make a very sketchy kind of overview of how the question of reality and materiality has been dealt with in the classical phenomenological tradition from Husserl up to Merleau-Ponty and not beyond. Maybe we can get back to discussion of more recent representatives of the phenomenological tradition. I think a very interesting point of view, and often forgotten in the debates between Neorealism and phenomenology these days, that phenomenology, in fact, started as a realist philosophical endeavor with Husserl's logische Untersuchungen. And you all know this project. I don't think I need to get into details that the philosophical discipline that Husserl named descriptive psychology was a very anti-subjective, very anti-subjectivist philosophy designed in the first volume of the Logische Untersuchungen, defending a position of the realism, mind independence of logical and mathematical entities. And I think one could argue that from the second, especially from the sixth investigation, from the fifth and sixth investigation, Husserl developed something which can be called a realist theory of intentional representation. I think, I don't want to go into details right now. I did it in my book on Husserl to defend that I think Husserl has a realist conception of intentional representation, logische Untersuchungen, which means that in an intentional act, it is the qualities of the object that affects and determines the qualities of the subject, of the cognition, and not vice versa. That will be Husserl's transcendental turn when he will believe that these things are constituted by consciousness. In the logische Untersuchungen, Husserl believes that, in a way, this is the object that constitutes the intentional act which is directed to it. No wonder that Husserl's circle of students in his early years in Munich and Göttingen called themselves, as we all know, realist phenomenologists. And then, when Husserl had this transcendental turn, they were very much distinguishing themselves from Husserl, saying that what we do is a realist philosophy of phenomenology, whereas Husserl doing something which is a Kantian transcendental phenomenology. So if you know the history of phenomenological movement, I don't need to refer all these big names, van der Reinach, Geiger, Konrad Martius, and especially Ingarden, who was always criticizing Husserl for his transcendental turn and claiming that his phenomenology is a true phenomenology of a realist phenomenology. What this realism meant is that precisely the objective of the phenomenology was for these people the description of real things in a way, as they appeared through the meditation of intentional acts. That was basically a project of an object-oriented phenomenology for all the students of the first group of students of Husserl, which meant that they want to describe how real objects appear through the mediation of different representations and as in intentional acts. In fact, Husserl in IDN 1 distinguish between object-oriented phenomenology and subject-oriented phenomenology. And he says, what I'm doing in the Ideum 1 is a subject-oriented phenomenology. But in the second volume, he said, and he already promises I will do as an object-oriented. So Husserl is using this language of object-oriented and subject-oriented in his early years himself. So he's well aware that there is something as a realist phenomenological project. It needs to be added that this realist phenomenological project never or very rarely addresses the question of materiality. So what does it mean that the object not simply appears, but has a material composition or consistency? So the question of materiality was not very much dealt with in the real phenomenological, among even the realist phenomenology, not to mention Husserl, when he turns towards the transcendental perspective and undertakes his transcendental turn, as you all know, in the arguably from the 1907, 1908 onward. Now, we all know Husserl's transcendental theory, but it's interesting to see what kind of status he accords to the question of reality, because that's when the fate of reality within the phenomenological tradition starts to be decisive and decided. But we all know that the theory of transcendental subjectivity means in Husserl that it is a subject, whatever we mean by subject, as a constitutive agency of all possible reality, and the key term here that is the constitution which object appears through subjective appearances. So it's very simple, I think, to understand what Husserl means by subjective constitution. It is that, look around you, everything what you see now, including bodies, object, everything what you see is not the property of the object that you see, but is the property of the subject who is looking at these things. That's transcendental constitution. What appears is not the property of the objects. The way the object appears is dependent on this very subject who is looking at these objects. And that is, in that way, we are constituting all this what we see right now through the appearances, through the Erscheinungen. And that's it. That's a constitutive theory. You see, in this way, the question of reality becomes one of the mode of how we look at the world. It becomes a subjective kind of dimensional element and not an ontological kind of sphere of realm of object themselves. So from this point of view, it's interesting to see what kind of notions Husserl is using when he describes reality. Basically, he has three different notions for reality: Realität, Wirklichkeit, and reale Inhalt. The Realität is the objective word as it's given in the natural attitude, but it's an attitude. It's not an ontological sphere. Realität is a consequence of an attitude. The natural attitude, which is distinguished from the transcendental attitude, in which there is no reality, Realität as such. The Realität is that attitude which obviously undermines and undergrounds the position of all objective sciences and the everyday life position of human being. There is Wirklichkeit, which is a doxic notion to be distinguished from imagination, from memory, from all kinds of representation which do not have a real object, but has an imaginary object or a representative object in forms of a memory or in forms of anticipation or in form of a dream, for example. Wirklichkeit in this way, again, does not refer to an ontological sphere of objects. It is a doxic modality, a subjective mode of cognition, the result of a subjective mode of cognition which is distinguished from other possible subjective mode of cognitions. And finally, there is this mystery of real Inhalt, that why Husserl uses the notion of real, not real, because real is Realität, that's already sorted out, real Inhalt, and he means by the most subjective elements of consciousness by real Inhalt, the Cogitationes, the Erlebnis und Empfindungen, which means the very elements of which subjectivity is built up, the lived experiences on their own level, which are not intentional, obviously, they're not intentional objects. When what you live through is not intentional. You don't have an intentional relationship with your own self. Only when you reflect to it, then you have an intentional relationship. Otherwise, you live it, and this lived status Husserl characterized real. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe we can get back to this discussion. Probably it goes back to Kant, I guess. Kant uses Kant's notion of intuition. Kant also says it's at the time uses the notion of real when he describes the notion of time experience in the first critique. It's an interesting question, but not more as a philological question, because for Husserl, real in this sense means merely and purely subjective. It is in fact the most subjective that you can imagine, the real in this sense. You will see that whole so-called materialist phenomenological materialism in the form of Michel Henry's philosophy continue this way, and will argue that materialism in terms of phenomenology is the most effective subjective elements that you can imagine. So this is how we lose basically reality in the phenomenological tradition, and this loss is even more stronger when we jump to Heidegger's notion of reality and his refusal of taking the problem of reality seriously. Heidegger says, as you know, in the 43rd third paragraph of Zion Inside, which the title is The Problem of Reality, he says that the question of reality, external world, transcendent being, mind-independent reality, is a false philosophical problem. He is referring to Dilthey's famous essay on proving the external reality, saying that the scandal of philosophy, what Dilthey called the scandal of philosophy, is not that we're still looking for, that we don't have the proof for the external reality. The scandal of philosophy is that we are still looking for a proof to prove that external reality exists. And he says that precisely, the question of reality is not an authentic philosophical problem. The authentic philosophical problem is the being in the being in the world, the Inderweltsein. And the Inderweltsein, the facticity of Inderweltsein is already the answer to the question of reality. You cannot answer the question and even ask the question of reality, but on the ground of already presupposing that you are in a world, existing in a world. And therefore, you need to understand what does it mean being in a world. And in the sense, the question of the world is much more fundamental than that of reality. Reality is an abstract, theoretical problem. The basic question is rather, what does it mean being in a world? What does it mean to be disclosed at Schlossenheit of the Dasein, which is the ontological fundament that constitutes all elements of a possible reality. So in this sense, Heidegger refused to take seriously the problem of reality on the excuse that he discovered a more fundamental level, which doesn't even deserve the name of reality, because the being in the world, the constitutive relationship between Dasein and the world, is not real by no means, it's existential. And existential in its structure, very much like in Husserl, is a transcendental category. Obviously, existential means that this is the subject who projects basically the world as such, and therefore the question of reality, and especially mind-independent reality, doesn't simply make sense for Heidegger. Now, I know it's very sketchy and very quick, but let's just jump from here to the same question in Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, because it's interesting to see that for them, for post-Husserlian and post-Heideggerian phenomenologists, the question of reality and materiality in a way comes back from behind, because for these thinkers, the basic question is what can resist to subjective or transcendental constitution, and when they ask this question, they kind of orient themselves towards an apprehension of reality and materiality, which in a way was lacking. Both Husserlian and Heideggerian phenomenology was, as we see, rejected or simply not addressed. Now, Sartre's answer in being nothing less is obviously emblematic from this point of view, because he reclaims a very strong notion of reality in the form of en soi, distinguished with the pour soi, for the self. And the being of things, Sartre says, is impenetrable by the consciousness or existence. It's opaque and self-enclosed being. It exists without human mediation, the en soi. And this is precisely the purely objective and material nature of things. Now, the jump is radical from Husserl and Heidegger to Sartre, and Sartre claims that yes, we have a reality just here, like this table, and this has nothing to do with me, and I don't have an access to this table in its own ontological structure. The same line of argumentation continues in Sartre's later work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, when he says that this is the notion of, he coins the notion of practical inert, or practical inerts, which is the elements of human practice, which precisely relies on this material level, and it exists on its own. It can be transformed by human praxis, but it also resists to human praxis. It sets a limit to human praxis in its material composition, and that's the word. Now, you see, Sartre wants to regain the sense of reality, but the price he needs to pay for that is abandoning phenomenology. Already one could argue that even the being and nothingness is not a phenomenological work. It's the category of en soi and pour soi is you all know, it's a dialectical or Hegelian appropriation, even more so in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is a Marxist work in its design. So in a way, Sartre is the first speculative realist, if you want. His categories are there. He reclaims reality, but he abandons phenomenology almost completely. And he abandons it explicitly in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, switching to Marxism, switching to Hegelianism in his articulation. The question precisely, why is that? So we understand that he wants to get back reality, but why not through phenomenological means? So that's the question of how we can imagine or design a realist phenomenology, if we want to tackle these questions. Merleau-Ponty's example is even more striking. He also wants to get back to reality and materiality. That's what he calls, in his late philosophy, the ontological rehabilitation of the sensible. But he never uses the notion of reality nor materiality. There are two reasons why. First of all, because he wants to criticize Sartre by all means. So he doesn't want to reappropriate Sartrean categories. If Sartre uses the notion of matter and reality, then Merleau-Ponty won't use it. That's not very founded philosophy argument. At the same time, Merleau-Ponty wants to get away with the notion of matter and reality, precisely not to distinguish it from the self or the subjectivity. So this is how his notion of être monde in phenomenological perception comes to the fore. It is not Interweltsein in the sense that Merleau-Ponty goes back to the notion of body and nature when dealing about the existence in the world, something Heidegger never did. Nature and body for Heidegger, at least for the early Heidegger, we can discuss about what middle Heidegger or late Heidegger did with the notion of nature, notion of physis precisely, but never with the body. The body is almost completely absent in, as you know, Heidegger's philosophy, except a few indications in the Leibniz courses in 28 and other texts. But Merleau-Ponty, on the contrary, wants to go back to nature and body. At the same time, doesn't talk about reality from a phenomenological point of view. That's understandable, but doesn't address the question of matter by no means. That's not really understandable why he does that. No materiality of the nature and the body. It's a kind of strange idea to claim that we have a body and the nature, but there's no matter inside. Only visibility, sensibility, tactability. This is something I will challenge in my argument, as you will see. Now, in his late Ontology, again, he's complicating things. He says that neither the world exists nor with man nor without man. There's the old question of chiasm, reversible interrelation between the two. And the model is always the touching, which means that when I touch, I don't simply touch myself, I touch a word touching me in a way, which means that neither element can be reduced to another. And it's not a simple dialectical solution, as in Sartre, as you know, because it's not a categorical distinction. Distinction is a truly phenomenological distinction between the body and the word. And yet, Merleau-Ponty does not reclaim, by all means, the notion of matter, no reality. Instead, he introduces the notion of flesh, chair in French, which is the element he claims to discover, the word, a concept that never been named in philosophy, and which is precisely the element which reunites us with nature through our body without dissolving existence into the body, without dissolving the things from a subjective perspective. Hence the flesh is nature, without being objective and without being material for Merleau-Ponty. So he says explicitly the flesh is not material. There is no materiality in the chair, except when he says that there is very allegedly in his notes that there is something which he calls the flesh of the world, chair du monde. Chair du monde is not the the flesh of the self. From the flesh of the self, you need to distinguish between the flesh of the word. So the word has its own flesh, according to Merleau-Ponty, and yet he doesn't say it's material. So what kind of consistency can the word have as a flesh if it's not material? So that's a mystery why Merleau-Ponty was very much resisting to using the notion of matter and materialism in that way. I mean, I have no better explanation than his critical stance from Sartre. I mean, if you have a better one, obviously, I would like to very much to know that. Now, I know I could proceed on with this sketchy kind of characterization of history of phenomenology, but I think the problem is clearly visible. Do we lose something if we don't address the question of reality and materiality from a phenomenological point of view? I think yes, we do, definitely. We have a certain limit to address the question of embodiment, of nature, of reality, of things, of artificial things or organic and inorganic things, and I think it's visible that phenomenology was systematically avoiding to ask the very simple question, what is matter from a phenomenological point of view? I mean, they could redefine almost everything, including body, unconsciousness, desire, subject, everything. Why couldn't they provide a phenomenological definition of matter? That's my question. Why not? And for some reason, it did not happen. So do we need a realist turn in phenomenology? I'm not sure if we need a turn, but we definitely need, I think it can be argued, need a realist and materialist extension of phenomenology if we want to be able to capture the four following categorical realms, which I think important, crucial, inevitable to understand the constancy of the world and, in fact, our life and world from a materialist point of view. And this is all lacking from the classical and contemporary phenomenological approaches. So the nature of natural phenomena, as it's lived by humans and animals, and as it exists, it's in its material nature, in material consistency. Understanding nature not as it being experienced or as it being appearing through sensitivity, affectivity, and visibility, but understanding nature and its materiality. I think that's one of the key issues that phenomenology need to address. Also, we need to understand, second, the materiality of life, the material reality of life, which we metabolic processes. The fact that we eat, we breathe, and we have a metabolic, material relationship to, except Hans Jonas, no one ever asked the question: what does it mean that a subject needs to eat? Subjectivity needs to eat in order to survive. There is no phenomenology of eating, neither breathing, by the way. Scheler has Scheler has went far, but Scheler was like, he was doing everything at the same time and doing phenomenology in a very funny way. Scheler has many reflections on these kind of things, but not systematic. What does it mean that a subject needs to eat? What is eating? Putting a material into this body and then get rid of it at the end of the day. But what is it? Is it an experience? Of course. Does phenomenology provide an account for this phenomena? No way, by no means. And obviously you can also talk about the vulnerabilities, something which has been addressed in recent theories very much. Aging, again, something which not been addressed except Max Scheler and some working notes of Husserl and Simone de Beauvoir, but it's more from a social point of view. Aging, which means that your body not simply lives in its phenomenal constancy, but it goes through a temporal transformation and it's gaining and then losing its whole entire existence. I mean, could we imagine a more fundamental and factical experimental thing than aging? Do we have a phenomenological theory of aging? No, we don't. Never have. Also, the objective and material reality of the world composed of elemental subjectives: earth, water, air, and fire. I mean, I know it sounds silly to say that, but at the same time, I mean, this is what we are all surrounded in this material universe. I mean, just imagine imagine a Husserlian description of a burning house. Burning, a house that is burning. Husserl would say, we have an intentional relationship to this house, we have Abschattungen, and we have a certain sensibility because we feel the heat and smell the smoke. And then the house suddenly collapses. It's destroyed by the fire. Husserl would say, no, we have a different intentional object. We had a house in a minute ago. Now we have only ashes and some smoke instead of the house. So the intentional object has changed. Would you say that it's an accurate description of what has happened? Where is the element of fire or destruction of material destruction caused by the fire in this description? Where is the fire in this experience? Can we just simply say it was like there was a house and there's no house? For Husserl, the same, like I'm looking at a house, no, I don't look at a house. Here, I look at a house and there's no house anymore. What happened with the material destruction of the house by the fire from an intentional point of view? You cannot account for it. There's no place for this phenomena that the house not simply disappeared, but has been destroyed by a process caused by fire. There's no phenomenology of fire in this sense. Gaston Bachelard tried to do something in a very funny way in his psychoanalysis of the fire. He felt very much this lack in classical phenomenological theories. And finally, we have the cosmos and cosmological reality of life, again addressed last time basically Max Scheler. What does it mean that we're living in a cosmos? And the cosmos is not a simple phenomenological object among others. It is something which is a universal object, an object that conditions us and absolutely animates us and puts us into a very interesting, more than interesting, it's a very expose the situation in our being in the world. Yes, Husserl has his working notes about the cosmological aspects and the retroactive constitution of human life. From a transcendental point of view, these are very much like speculations and not phenomenological kind of accurate descriptions of the cosmological reality. Now, for all these reasons, I think we need a material and realist reorientation in phenomenology. The question obviously would be, how would it look like? What can we do? What would the outline of realist position in phenomenology mean? And I think that conducting phenomenological research with the aim of exploring all that I just said, objective world and materiality, would not only weakening considerably the transcendental position that implicitly or explicitly all phenomenology can, since Husserl requires, precisely because there is a correlational relationship. But I think that the two fundamental questions that should be asked in a realist position is, what are the constituents of the material subsistence? And I have all these two questions in my text, at the end of my text, that you hopefully read. What are those constituents that are proved to be irreducible to the realm of subjective experiencing? So that's the most general question of realist phenomenology. And on the contrary, what are the constituents of the subject's own existence experience that cannot be explained by means of the analysis of the inherent subjective or existential performances? So what is in you that you cannot explain through your own experiencing it? And you have it, and you have many material things, especially in your body, the constitution, that you experience, see, even feel, and you cannot account for from analyzing this feeling, this visibility, this experience. The phenomenon of aging is precisely that. You know you age, you don't. Sometimes you experience you age at the same time. The experience of aging doesn't explain what aging is precisely, because you age in levels where you don't experience at all. Now, I would say that if one wants to do a phenomenology of reality and materiality, especially, then phenomenology could only take a role a propedeutic and not a fundamental philosophy or not a pure experimental philosophy. So, if we want to keep phenomenology, it's still arguable if we need to. I'm kind of claiming that yes. Then phenomenology can be at best a propedeutic for a realist or materialist philosophy of life and the world, which means that there can be no pure or fundamental phenomenology of material reality, and this is for principal reasons. Because precisely material reality is what transcends the realm of experience. So if it transcends it, then you cannot access to it from a phenomenological point of view. Because phenomenological realism precisely consists in claiming that there are certain conditions of experience that are not the conditions properly belong to the experiencing subject. So conditions of experience that not comes from the side of the subject, but comes from the side of the objects. They're still experimentable, at the same time cannot be accounted for from an experimental point of view. But material reality, although it cannot be accessed, it can be factically indicated in experience in ways that it makes possible its categorical analysis. Now, I would distinguish between phenomenological description and categorical analysis. Categorical analysis is something which you not necessarily do on the basis of experiments or experiencing. Categorical analysis is, in a way, conceptual analysis. If you want, you call it speculative, but it is a speculativity that is controlled by experience. So my solution would be that materiality is indicated in experience, but cannot be reduced to experience. And the philosophical task would be systematically uncover those points of limits where reality presents itself in experience without being reducible to the categories of experience. The indication is a key word here, obviously. I use it a lot in my essay. If you can use it, call it like transcendental indication. Sartre uses once this notion of transcendental indication, which means that something appears in the self, which is alien in the self, but appears still in the realm of the self, something which is in its constitution is alien to the categories of self. That's what Sartre called the transcendental indication. You have something which leads beyond your own field of experiencing. This is something which I'm kind of outlining here. We need to be attentive to those indication experience that leads outside the field of experience, precisely towards reality and materiality. Two examples One of them contact, another is aging. And then I will finish my presentation and we can jump to my text. Two examples, what does it mean that something is indicated experience but leads beyond experience? And you need to have a philosophical categorization on its own in order to approach it. Contact. If you look on this table, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty would say, you have an objective reality here, you have objects here in their phenomenological, and they have Abstrakungen. You see this side of the object, but adumbrations, but you don't see the other side. These objects hide one another. You have a perspective in a way, and these objects are constituted perspective for you, so you cannot see all of them. They, one after the other, they have a depth, a profondeur, as Merleau-Ponty would say. In a way, they look at you. In a way, they present themselves, and you look at them. This is the chiasmic relationship. Now, you can say everything about this situation except one thing you cannot understand based on visibility and sensibility. The fact that these things not simply there, presenting themselves and hiding themselves, but touching themselves. This object touch this object, and this object touch this object. And this table holds them too. And this table is held by the ground over there. Now, from this perspective, the thing that you cannot understand, although you cannot explain from a phenomenological point of view, although you understand it, that these objects are not only covering themselves, presenting themselves, hiding themselves, but also touching themselves, which means they are in contact with another. They are in contact with another. You understand that they are in contact, at the same time you cannot explain the fact of the contact, neither by visibility nor by sensibility. Because the between the cocktail between these two objects are not touch, and it is not simply visible. It is, if you want, physical. There is resistance, there is shaping, there is marking. Object can destroy one another. If I put a heavy object here, they will destroy it. It's contact. But this fact of contact between these objects, and that is the composition of the entire material universe around us. And look around, everything is in contact with everything. That cannot be accounted for by the experience of visibility and the experience of sensibility. The touching only introduces you to this realm, but the two objects are not touching one another. You touch an object, objects that don't touch, they are in contact. Now here's the indication. You know that they are in contact. At the same time, if you want to understand what contact means, you cannot use experience anymore as a guiding thread. You need to think in terms of the object. What does it mean that two objects are in contact to one another? Resistance, shaping, limiting, marking, holding, whatever. You find the categories. These categories are controlled over experience. These are not physical categories. So you don't say, there are atoms here and there are whatever. You don't need a physical explanation. You need an ontological explanation based on the fact that this contact is indicated in experience but cannot be explained by experience. You need a theory of contact, of objective contact, based on the fact that the contact is visible, in a way sensible, at the same time cannot be reducible to the experience categories. Same with aging, and here I come to the question of temporality, materiality. Object do age. I mean, we all know that, right? At the same time, there is no phenomenological theory of aging, objective aging. You know, wine is aging very well. I mean, we know that, right? Do we know what's going on in aging when a wine ages? We have physical explanations. At the same time, we all know that there's a certain temporality of that liquid. And this temporality is marred by the fact that it is not conscious temporality, because it doesn't have memory. It doesn't have reversibility. It doesn't have anticipation. Nothing it doesn't have, which human temporality has. And it's still a temporality. So how do you account for it? Obviously, not on the basis of subjective time experience, as Heidegger and Husserl would easily claim. Heidegger says there is no natural time, only doesn't time exist. Husserl says objects are geschichtlos, they don't have history. Is it plausible to say that? I don't think it is. Object has their own temporality. They change over time, they mark by time, they can be destroyed time and they can be born in time. They have their own temporality. Again, their temporality is indicated into experience, but if you want to understand what does it mean that objects have temporality, you cannot use the subjective temporal structure as a clue, because precisely objects don't have a temporality like subjective consciousness has. So this is again an indication. Obviously you understand that they have even experience, because you experience it in your body, that's your aging. Experience that matter and real is changing. But if you want to describe it philosophically, you need to switch from phenomenological explanation, description, into categorical appropriation. And using notions like irreversibility, durability, and historicity. Things have their own history. you know, Brodel has wrote his entire historical work over the fact that human history is conditioned by the history of the wind, the sun, the sea, as material elements that constituted an entire culture called the Mediterranean, Serbia included for him. So that's what I wanted to say. I wonder if the arguments and the examples made sense. But precisely at this point, where my text begins by asking precisely what does it mean that we have a historicity and historical facticity that more than subjective history, more than subjective time awareness. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you for the inspiring and very dynamic lecture. Given the fact that Damir and Jacob have to leave a little bit earlier, let's go to the first round. We have Rasko, Damir, and Jacob.
I will start only with one question. There is in which we are, many of us at this institute are interested in and invested in. It's the question about social ontology.
Yeah.
And the role of phenomenology, because I think that the current social ontology could show us that there is some kind of reconciliation between realistic point of view on the world and subjective cognition, or what you said, what you called realist theory of international representation. Why? Because in the current social ontology there is a widespread view that social world is ontological subjective, but epistemological objective. Social world.
Yeah.
And there is another world, physical world of things. And when you mentioned die Wirklichkeit, between reality, between die Realität und das reelle Inhalt in Husserl's theory, that die Wirklichkeit, what represents actually social world.
Yeah.
That's the objects constructed through our mental attitudes.
Yes.
And collective acceptance and ascribing statuses to the objects in the world and they are existing. I mean, police officer, he exists. So I think, so let's start with this brief question. So I think in the modern social ontology, with the help of phenomenological methodology, there is a assumption, widespread assumption that there is a reconciliation between reality and subjective cognition. So
yes. No. Do I?
Okay. Please.
Now you tell me what's the.
Go.
Because no, I'm very sensitive to the question of social ontology, and in fact, if you want to know, it's personal detail, but I was interested in social ontology at the first place, and especially my text that has been Mark just mentioned it, published in your journal about Husserl and Simmel. It's about precisely criticizing the kind of claiming that social ontology can be a solution for many problems in Husserlian theory, if you take into account the fact that human institutions and human collective agencies are brought about a specific realm that cannot be reused back to subjectivity, cannot be understood on the basis of subjective constitution. At the same time, it has its own ontological sovereignty. But my problem with the social ontology is that precisely your distinction between social and physical.
yeah.
So for me, an ontology that doesn't account for the material conditions of their own constitutive processes is an ontology that lacks grounding.
So police officer, it's a material thing.
Police
It's a status.
No.
It's a status function
No.
ascribing to
Police officer is not a material thing.
To a police dress. No? That's a material thing. There is no police officer without a proper dress.
But the dress is nothing to do with the police officer. The police officer.
But that's a material thing.
It's a material thing, but not in its status as police clothes. It is material in its material constitution as something sensible, something durable as an object. But this materiality, at least this level of explanation, nothing has to do with the fact that this very clothes is imbued with the value of a meaning of that legal status that is according to the person who is wearing it. So there, the clothes has no social value in its materiality. Obviously, it is a social value according to a certain symbol, and the person who is kind of accorded the legal status of being a policeman that makes these clothes in its materiality, police officer's clothes. So, in this sense, you know, what we are dealing with is values. It's precisely my problem with all social ontologies, that values are lacking precisely in their ontological explanation, material foundation. So my perspective is like let's reverse the whole thing and start from materiality, and let's see how far we can get in explaining social behaviors, in explaining the constitution of the social world. If we start from scratch, from the very fact that we take into account the material conditions that are prevailing possibly in every kind of social constructionism. And I repeat, that's what historians do. That's what art school historians always did. Yeah. They wanted to understand the material conditions first, and then in a way gradually get to the point when you can explain why Philip II has been such a great king of Spain and the Mediterranean, what he was. And Brothers' explanation, again, I repeat, comes with the wind and the rain, and says Philip has become such a social kind of construction where he was because he could use the wind and the sun and the rain, and his culture could use it in a way that no one else did before, like crossing the Atlantic with the wind, you know. So this is what my widest imagination is, to get to the point when you can start better understanding how social institutions and social constitutions can function through the understanding of their material embeddedness. Which means you don't stop at the point of that the policeman has a clothes. You want to understand what does it mean to have a body as a social agent? What does it mean that the body needs to be dressed? What does it mean that the body has a contact with the world? That's where the ontological explanation, in my view, would begin. And then, I don't know how far we can get, and if we really can reach the level of social in this ontology, but it's worth trying.
Of embodiment.
It is the question.
That's what you want to do.
Yes, and to see to how far we can understand embodiment as a material and social configuration. But this time starting with the material, not the social. So not deducing materiality out of its social existence, but on the contrary, try to understand what is the meaning of the social if we consider it from a materialist point of view.
Then you should perhaps start with Merleau-Ponty and with the body.
That's what I'm doing, exactly.
That's what
except on the fact that Merleau-Ponty never addressed the question of the materiality of the body as such. Yeah. So I'm doing, in a way, Merleau-Ponty, but getting rid of Merleau-Ponty because he didn't really much to offer if we ask about the material condition. Merleau-Ponty nothing to say about the contact of object, I mean, the flesh of the world, chair du monde, that is something, but he never elaborated this idea. I mean, he couldn't because he died, obviously. But that's, if you want, yes. What I'm doing is the flesh of the world, in its material constitution. And to see how it induces experiences, how it affects subjective formation of subjectivity, singular and collective. So yes, that's my project is planned to be culminating in a philosophy of history or phenomenology of history. It is through historicity and temporality that I want to, I feel able to reach the question of the social and the question of the culture.
Okay, the question of history is something else, but later, yeah. But okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay,
thank you for your interesting ideas. There are many questions, but I give just two contributions to the discussion. And the first one has something to do with something different, but I think the relationship between Husserlian phenomenology and the historicism.
And history, yeah.
Because my question is, can you say something about the difference about the usage of phenomenological or usage of the concept of history in a phenomenological context, in a phenomenological sense, and his usage of this notion or concept in history, like, I don't know, real time. That would be my first question. And the second one is to deal with phenomenologists. I think that you know him, Wilhelm Schaap, and his so-called Phenomenology of Stories, Philosophie der Geschichten. Schaap is someone who I think anticipate maybe you can say Ricoeur and his theory of narration. And I took a quote from his work in Geschichten verstrickt. We can translate it in tangled in stories. And this quote says the story, you can say, well, history cannot be explored as an object because something is a story or history just insofar as I entangled in the story or history. How must the realistic phenomenology deal with this way of narrative simplicity?
Well, yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question. Let me answer by quotation from Louis Althusser. In his late writings, Althusser defines materialism by saying that I call materialist that philosophy that stops telling stories. I'm very much sympathizing with this attitude. Get rid of the stories, and in fact narrativity if you wish, or limit it to its own place and not letting be used as a pattern or model of explanation of all kinds of things that don't behave or don't obey to the laws of narrativity. And I think in this case I would simply say that, as I did my essay, that Ricoeur has emblematic position from this point of view, because he discovers at one time the reality of historical objects and the sovereignty of historical object when he says that we have a representation of past through the traces, the objects brings us a certain history by the very fact that they were existing in a different time. You know, that's what every archaeologist or geologist or museologist would say, that this object dates from the 17th century. That means this object has its historical conditions built into its structure. At the same time, Ricoeur also does the narrativity of history. But for me, my project is that let's cut off the narrativity and keep the objective kind of orientation, try to explain what does it mean that this object belonged to the 17th century. What does it mean? Does it mean that we have a story that we can tell about the object? I think more than that. It means that this object was born, created in a certain time, a certain space. And this very fact that it was created 300 years ago is inscribed into its, if you want, physical structure. I mean, it bears with its old temporal individuation. And it's not simply the story that you can tell about this object. It's physical ontological fact. Irreversible fact. You cannot do anything against it. That this object was born in that age. It's an inalterable fact. It's irreversible. You need to understand that this is a condition of possibility of history. That there are things which are inalterable and irreversible. If you don't have that, you have stories. But you don't have historical stories. The stories can be all kinds of stories. History is one way of telling stories. What made a historical story specific is the fact that they rely on the precondition that things cannot be simply altered by memory, by retroactive constitution, by unconscious desires. That's what why this object can serve as a guide, as a guiding thread for historical stories, and not just any kind of stories. The precondition is that you have a temporality within this object, which is a factical, inalterable, irreversible temporality. And that's what I would call history and deep history in the authentic sense. The narrations, with the historical meaning formation, builds on this structure and becomes historical, and becomes historical narrativity. So for me, from all phenomenological theories of history, Husserl, Heidegger included, is missing precisely the explanation of the material temporality, which underlies all kinds of historical meaning formations. And that's why that's where history really makes sense. The fact that you can things that you cannot relive anymore, which has been lost for forever, which are irreversible. You cannot simply go back and change them. You can do it by meaning, but the meaning always relies on this precondition of very rigid, linear if you wish, empirical temporality, that one thing follows the other, and you cannot alter this order of things. If I break this pen right now, you can do nothing to go back in time and put that together. You can put it back together physically, but you cannot change the event that I break it. That was, and here's a rigid order of time. I think this rigid order of time is in the structure of matter, not in the consciousness. Consciousness can change anything, you know, anything. I mean, you can remember, not remember, forget anything. Objects do not forget. Objects do not forget, because they don't have a consciousness, but they don't have temporality. So I think this level of historical temporality has not been addressed in phenomenology by no means. Dilthey is a very interesting figure from this point of view. I think the phenomenological tradition was very, very unjust with Dilthey. Husserl's Heidegger reading of Dilthey is like finishing him off, as if he had been just, you know, a social scientist who was engaging himself into philosophy and psychology. I think completely unjust reading. Even in Heidegger's Kassel lectures, when you really appreciate Dilthey, is that he was discovering the ontological conditions of history. I think it's completely false reading. Dilthey was much more embedded into this question than Husserl ever was. Of course, he has his limits, because he was dealing with his own contemporary science and psychology, and therefore he had objective limits to address this question on their own level. But Dilthey was very attentive to the historicity in other way than Husserl and Heidegger was, because Dilthey never reduced historicity to a subjective performance. Never. He privileged the collectivity, the culture, and the culture was also for Dilthey material culture. Culture of things and not only culture of values. So I think reading Dilthey today from this point of view can be very useful, except the limitation of the Dilthey philosophy. But I think we need to free Dilthey from the phenomenological lecture, that's for sure. And on that I'm fully agree with you. Thank you.
Are you, then you're speaking about the Naturgeschichte.
Yes, I do.
But then there is a problem. How can you reduce subjectivity to the Naturgeschichte?
It's not reducing. It's not a question of reducing. It's a question of understanding. So let's understand the subject. You know, normally when phenomenological theories address the question of nature, it's always already an established point of subjectivity. So you have the subject first, like transcendental or whatever. You have the Dasein first, and then you ask the question, okay, let's see, oh, does this subject have a body? Yes, that's good. So let's see, how is it related to nature? I think we should reverse the perspective. Understand what nature first and what body first, and then understand what subjectivity is. So I want to go, it might be a false path, I don't know. I just want to see to how far can we get in understanding subjectivity and intersubjectivity if we don't start with the fact that these subjectivity exists, but we start with the fact that these subjects belong and born out originally from a physical nature environment. And try to understand what kind of image of subject we get if we take seriously, and for a start, the fact that these are embodied, natural, and material entities.
That's the problem, yeah, that's the problem, because I don't know what could you gain, you know, from such a move, such theoretical and methodological move. I mean,
maybe a new concept of human subject, maybe a new concept of human intersubjectivity, maybe a new concept of history and social categories, which is very conform the way you experience the reality around yourself. Maybe that.
I don't know. I don't know.
Neither do I at the moment, but it's worth trying, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Okay. Ja ću na njemačkom i prevešću to što to neće radi. Okay, durch Ihren sehr guten Vortrag bekam ich neue Fragen. Also, aber ich halte mich jetzt an das, was ich geschrieben habe. Aber zuvor sage ich, also mir scheint es, also nach Ihrem Vortrag, dass Sie eigentlich von einer hermeneutischen oder narrativen Wende, also wenn Sie von materiellen Wende sprechen, eigentlich müssen von einer hermeneutischen oder historizistischen oder narrativen Wende in der Phänomenologie sprechen. Und da haben wir gute Beispiele. Dilthey haben Sie erwähnt, aber auch doch Heidegger, der nicht so subjektivistisch ist wie Ricoeur darstellt oder Sie, wie ich aus Ihrem Text entnommen habe. Also wir korrigieren Sie mich. Dakle, prije nego što pređem na ovo, dakle, a i vidjeli smo iz ovih prvih razgovora, dakle da se u stvari ovdje, ja bih prije rekao da se, kada govorimo o materialističkom zaokretu u okviru fenomenologije, stvari moramo govoriti o hermeneutičkom ili narativističkom ili historicističkom zaokretu u okviru fenomenologije. I tu je sad pitanje da udjela prirode ili već prirodnog supstrata ili šta već, to je sad drugo pitanje. Ali držat ću se opet ovog svog koncepta, šta sam ovdje predložio. Dakle, dva polja, dva pitanja. Also, ich habe hier die zwei Fragen, beziehungsweise zwei Felder, wo ich die hier Ihnen vorschlagen möchte. Die erste betrifft also die Hermeneutik, also eigentlich die Phänomenologie und die Frage der Materialität der Medien, also der Vermittlung. Und da Sie kennen das vielleicht, das ist ein Vorschlag für Sie, dass Sie das vielleicht prüfen, dass Sie vergleichen Ihren Ansatz der Materialität der Wende mit der Kritik von Medientheorie der 60er und 70er Jahre an der Hermeneutik und Phänomenologie. Und da sind meistens dann zwei Namen zu nennen, also Friedrich Kittler und Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht. Ja. Gumbrecht. Das sind eigentlich Germanisten gewesen, aber die haben sich halt an diese Materialität der Medien also stark in den Vordergrund gestellt. Im Gegenzug zu Strukturalismus, den sie auch bekämpft haben, der eine Idealität der Strukturen sozusagen vorgebracht. Dakle, ovdje je pitanje hermeneutike i materijalnosti medija, koje ja njemu predlažem kao jedan koncept na osnovu kojeg će onda možda usporedi svoje intervencije u fenomenologiji sa ovom kritikom filozofije medija, odnosno teorije medija iz 60. i 70. godina, a tu prije svega mislim na Friedricha Kittlera i Hans-Ulrich Gumbrechta, koji su stvari kao, oni su bili germanisti, bavili se germanistikom, ali su imali taj koncept kritike hermeneutike i fenomenologije, koju ću sad da izložim. Also das sind diese Hauptpunkte, ich mache das jetzt kürzer. Das heißt, was kritisieren Sie da? Die kritisieren die an der Hermeneutik und Phänomenologie die Idealität des Sinns, also das Haften an der Idealität des Sinns. Die halten die Materialität, also der Vermittlung der Medien, zum Beispiel der Schrift, da ist auch der Derrida zu nennen natürlich, als sekundär. Und natürlich das Primär ist das Suchen nach dem eigentlichen Sinn, also so den authentischen Sinn. Und dann die Hermeneutik nach dieser Kritik vernachlässigt die Eigenwertigkeit der Zeichenprozesse und Diskurse. Und dann muss sie sich auch die Rechenschaft über die Historizität der Letztbegründungen, also der eigenen Theorien, also der Historizität der Phänomenologie als Letztbegründung sozusagen Rechenschaft geben. Dakle, koji su to, šta oni kritikuju na hermeneutici, to je prije svega, da sažem, dakle, to držanje, dakle, fokus na idealnosti smisla, traženje, dakle, materijalnost posredovanja i pisma i medija i uopšte transporta smisla se smatra sekundarnim, onda vrijednost ovih procesa označavanja ili simboliziranja se zapušta, odnosno stavlja u drugi plan diskursa i tako dalje. I uopšte sama hermeneutika i fenomenologija kao nekakav pokušaj posljednjeg utemeljenja ili konačnog utemeljenja u stvari treba da samo refleksivno u stvari preispitaju sopstvenu istoričnost. Was die vorschlagen, also, und da können Sie vielleicht eigene Punkte vielleicht irgendwo in diesen, sozusagen, in diesem wieder, sozusagen, die wollen eigentlich die Präsenzerfahrungen in den Vordergrund stellen. Und da sind die moderne Momente der Insularität, Plötzlichkeit, Neubesetzung von Räumen, das Aufkommen des ästhetischen Erlebnisses und Präsenzeffekte. Also zum Beispiel die Plötzlichkeit, die Aufwertung der plötzlichen Erfahrungen, die keinen jetzt Zusammenhang gibt, sondern so einfach so präsent, die Materialität der Präsenz sozusagen im Vordergrund stellen. Also, und so weiter. Ja. Okay, da werde ich dann einiges überspringen. Okay, to su znači ti momenti koje oni zovu iskustva prezentnosti, dakle iskustva prisutnosti, ili kako se dakle, koje oni hoće da stave u prvi plan, dakle, da prisustvo ili prezentnost koje razumijevaju se karakteriše kroz momente, recimo, inzularnosti, to je znači udaljavanje od svakodnevnih iskustava, iznenadnosti, što se ozove, dakle, to su ovi iznenadna iskustva, dakle, materijalnost iznenadnog iskustva i prezentnosti nečega, na primjer strah ili zadovoljstvo ili dakle, ne smisao toga, nego jednostavno materijalnost, prisutnost nečega. I tako dalje, dakle, i efekti prisutnosti i tako dalje, sada ne duže. Der zweite Feld betrifft nur, also ich gehe hier wieder auf Ricoeur, also betrifft diese Frage der Faktizität des Historischen, also der Materialität des Historischen. Ich kürze das, ich habe jetzt hier einen Zitat von Ihnen aus einem Text entnommen, der vielleicht nicht so repräsentativ ist, ganz, ich werde mich da korrigieren, was ich jetzt in Kürze sagen möchte. Also, Sie haben das bei Heidegger schon. Faktizität ist nicht einfach die Materialität. Das heißt, was macht die Faktizität? Die leistet, das ist so, das heißt, er verwendet auch Gewesenheit, als Geworfenheit auch. Ja, als nicht Synonyme, aber als Beschreibung dieses Moments. Das heißt, wir kommen nicht aus dem Nichts, wir haben unsere Vorgeschichte, aber die Vorgeschichte ist keine jetzt Natur oder Realität oder Wirklichkeit, sondern das ist so ein Zusammenhang der wahrgenommenen Möglichkeit, existenzielle Möglichkeit, die dann das machen, dass unsere Möglichkeiten nicht beliebig sind. Das heißt, die Geschichte, unsere Geschichte verwebt sich zu einer Art Materialität, zu einer Dichte, die unsere Zukunft nicht beliebig macht. Ergreifen unsere Möglichkeiten. Und das ist die Geschichte. Das heißt nicht irgendwie, das ist die Materialität der Geschichte. Das heißt, dass dieses Ding dieses berührt, dass dieses Ding altert und die Momente der Möglichkeiten verweben sich und bedingen einander. Und das, was dazu kommt, ist nicht beliebig. Was ich ergreifen kann als meine Möglichkeit, als historische Möglichkeit, ist nicht beliebig. Und das ist die Natur der Geschichte, das Material der Geschichte, also nach meines Erachtens. Natürlich, da kommen dann auch können die natürlichen Momente hineinspielen. Aber das ist die Essenz unserer historischen Materialität. Dakle, samo još ovo da prevedim. Dakle, ovo pitanje materijalnosti istorije, dakle, pitanje fakticiteta kod Heideggera. Dakle, šta je ostvarena, prema mom mišljenju, materijalnost istorije? Materijalnost istorije je to, znači da mogućnosti koje smo, tako reći, realizovali kao istorijska bića, naša prošlost, nisu na neki način stvarnost postala kao nekakva istorija, nekakva vrsta priroda, naša priroda koju više ne možemo da promijenimo, nego su to u stvari međusobno isprepletene naše mogućnosti koje se međusobno uslovljavaju. I to čini našu istoriju. To nije nekakva realnost koja je postala i koja sad tako stoji kao nepromjenjiva, nego jednostavno one čine, to su mogućnosti naše koje jednostavno su u određenim korelacijama i koje čine našu istoriju i koje čine da mi ne možemo bilo kakve mogućnosti da, tako reći, uzmemo u obzir u našem daljoj egzistenciji ili u procesu istorije, nego jednostavno neke koje nam dozvoljava ta naša, tako reći, prošlost. To je materijalnost. A sad ne možemo tražiti ispod toga još sloj prirode, nužno, da bi otkrili materijalnost. Dakle, bios ili ne. Može da bude, ali ne. To nije esencija te materijalnosti istorije. Izvinjavam se na to. Danke. Ich hoffe, ich war verständlich. Okay. Sie können natürlich auf Englisch antworten.
Okay, I suggest that we correct some further
right, okay.
Order and that, please.
Okay, I will actually start with the conclusion of your lecture because I have so many questions about it. But the propedeutics for phenomenology is propedeutics for material philosophy of life, materialist philosophy of life. I'm not sure that I agree with that study because I am a realist. I'm a phenomenologist and a realist. So
and the
I'm a realist.
Oh, you're right, a realist. Cool.
In what sense? Maybe it's not the same.
Yeah.
What you presented here. So I don't think. First of all, I don't think that subjectivity is actually, like you said, sufficient, or not sufficient. We know so much about subjectivity. I don't think that we do. I think there's plenty of things to research, plenty of things we don't know about subjectivity. So I actually think that phenomenology is the study of the constitution of subjective experience and also the way in which objects are constituted by subjective experience. So I think it has its place as a field of research that focuses on subjectivity, on subjective experience, and on the way, of course, in which objects constitute, or material world, natural world, bodily processes constitute this experience. So in this sense, I agree with this entire theorist thesis that the world is ontologically independent from subjective experience. It affects us, we encounter objects in the world, and we can simply say that they are constituted. We have to admit they affect us with their objective material existence that we cannot simply change the way we want. So in this sense, I think we should talk about co-constitution of the phenomenological approach would be taking into account both ways, both directions of constitution, both this subjective experience constituting objective world, objective objects, and objective world constituting our subjective experience. And for example, I think that your examples of aging and eating, so we have a subjective dimension of this phenomena to explore. The same way we can explain it from a naturalist attitude, how these processes are physical and chemical and so on. We can also we can also try to analyze the subjective dimension of it. What kind of meaning we attribute to aging, how we cope with it. This could be something that we have to somehow face, accept our own aging or not. So there is an entire subjective dimension that's interesting, let's say, in itself, independently of this probabilitical role. So this exploration could be interesting for psychology of aging. Also, I think phenomenology could contribute to physics, taking into account the position of the observer, could actually maybe solve or help solve certain conceptual conclusions in the natural sciences. Maybe, I'm not sure. It's something that I'm working on, so in a couple of months I'll know more. So that's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to actually save room for phenomenology, not just as a probabilitics. And now to go to history. So I do agree with the main thesis of your text that we should be realists about history and about time. So there is an undeniable practicity of the material remains of certain past events as ontologically independent from subjective experience, and in fact constitutive of our experience of history, because they come at us. We have to somehow explain what we found, whether all doings or all documents. So I don't think that we should be realists, but I believe that we should try, again, co-constitution. We try to explore history both as constituted and as constituted. I think exploring these directions of co-constitution, distinguishing various levels of constitution on both sides are important. For example, because in your text I couldn't find a distinction between past and history. So simply past, the series of past events that are really happened, really occurred, and the things that are historically significant, things that make up our history. So how to, this is where the subject comes into, the subject has constituted role. So we single out certain events as historically significant because we care about them, about preserving them, about explaining them. If we didn't care about old rules, for example, we would just wipe them off, build something else. But we are, it is because we care about them that they are part of history, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, well, okay, let me finish it because I think I spoke a lot. But so phenomenological realism, I think, should take into account the subjective side of transcendental questions of constitution. I don't think that easily disposed of.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, thank you for your informative lecture, and for myself, very intriguing depth because it tackles very problems I'm dealing with regarding problems of historical consciousness. So I will do very specific questions regarding ideas of the text. First of all, I have marked that central idea for your text, one central idea, is division between traces or sources on one side, and history, subjective material history on the other. And there is also link with public care. Yes? But it is interesting to remember that this distinction, which we are today, our contemporary situation, are taking for granted, or commonsensical, in the historical perspective, is not such. We could say that Western European historical consciousness started to look at history through the lens of sources on one side and material history on the other, only at the beginning of approximately 19th century. And it's interesting to mention that when we first start to look at history as something which could be discovered through sources, textual sources was primary sources. If we took, for example, let's say something like a common layer book of biblical archaeology from the beginning of 19th century, we'll find different sources regarding biblical archaeology, for example, and there will be very little space for material sources, or almost nothing. Maybe coinage or some sort of ruins, and that's it. That's everything. All the other are textual sources. If we take, for example, something, well, even more relevant for history as a science, for example, Niebuhr's lectures on Roman history, we will find that he almost exclusively took textual sources as his sources.
Text is a matter.
Sorry?
Text is a matter.
I just would like to. And yes, we have a very different understanding of text. In Hebrew, for example, text is no more narrative which speaks about history and which it itself has a history, but as a trace, as a sign for a history which is behind text. And we have this sort of Baladin theory of Roman epic in Hebrew, where he tried to reconstruct unwritten earliest Roman history through the written sources we have. And this theory was soon abandoned. Not the half a century after Niebuhr, in Ádám, for example, we have a hard critique in Niebuhr's methodology, and we have a concentration towards material historical sources. And there is one interesting implication of Monden's approach of history, that Monden knew a whole lot about Roman history than Niebuhr, for example, but he didn't know much more about earliest Roman history, about which we have no written accounts. It's a problem because when we have advances in archaeology, in material dating, in material historical methodology, we have always a problem to connect this with existent historical narratives, which we have as presuppositions. And it's interesting that even today, Monden's texts about Römische Geschichte could be read as a seminal text. But it's interesting that regarding the periods about which have no narrative history, we could have only conjectures which we need to put in some narrative context. And I would just like to, in this context, pose three specific questions. First is almost the same as the professors about material status of narratives and texts. And one more problem that narrative, I think, is a constituent of history because, for example, you mentioned Fernand Braudel and Philip II who uses the wind. I would like to say that Philip's usage of wind is historical, but wind as wind is not historical, it's temporal. But if things are temporal, they are not necessarily historical. And I think that to say that things are historical, we could not exclude this narrative component of history. The second question would be regarding the lack of narrative element. If we exclude narrative element, if we tell we do not tell ourselves we do not need more stories, we need objective history, we need objective sources. There is very specific, let's say, functions of history which could be endangered. For example, discourses about victims. Could we tell to Holocaust victims, stop to tell stories. We would like to objectively know what Holocaust was, for example. And could we simply exclude narrative element and reduce history to object? If we do this, we are pinpointing one specific aspect of history. This is scientific, archaeological investigation of history, but we are denying all the complex structures and functions of history which history serves in our society. And the third question will be, could phenomenological study of forms, of different forms of historical consciousness, as I report here, it's not commonsensical that we have sources and we have on the other hand history. If we read Edward Gibbon's History of Rome, we will find a narrative which is speaking on the ground of sources and is not trying to go behind the sources. This was not, we have changes in our historical consciousness. Could phenomenology of, let's say, history or historicity benefit from the research regarding changes in our historical consciousness, rather than in ontology or material background of history? I mean, that, even in such a constellation, it is hard to speak even more about Geschichtlichkeit as an essence of history, which we could dissect, we could find, we could tell, okay, this is history and nothing else. It is much more interesting for me to look at the morphology, how our consciousness about history and what we think when we are speaking about history has changed during the course of we could even analyze the period from the Reformation to the 19th century, and we could detect different morphologies between text and history on the other side as a background of all this. Well, these are my questions in short. I hope that I was clear and distinct, because there's a lot of it.
Well, I think there's maybe a common axe of problematic that links all the three presentations together, and it's basically the crucial issue and one of the most fundamental, obviously, most interesting and most fundamental, most interesting topic and most fundamental challenge to what I'm trying to do. And this is basically that you were all addressing your point of view, is the question of relationship between meaning and matter. That's what we are. That's what is here at the historical knowledge and historical consciousness, how meaning and matter related. This is basically like your question about subjectivity, how it is that I experience the world and the world constitutes me. So what I make of my experience is related to material efficacy. And finally, your questions, it was basically about meaning and matter through facticity, through the hermeneutical cultural understanding of material objects and their embeddedness into a cultural context, which makes them more than pure, sheer physical objects. So I think it's a crucial issue here. But if I want to go backwards and starting with your questions and maybe objections, then I need to say that what I'm doing about history is not theory of knowledge of history, you know. My project doesn't have epistemological. I'm not looking for the conditions or possibilities of historical knowledge and the change of historical consciousness. I'm dealing with history from ontological point of view. So from this point of view, it's a little bit irrelevant for me if it really meets the criteria and conditions of historical sciences that they exist today or exist in the past, because ontological questions obviously cannot be deduced from the simple epistemological status of different questions, but on the contrary, if at best it can ground them. So for me, the notion of how historical consciousness has changed through our culture and to what way do we have access to something we can call historical objects, it is a secondary question from the point of view of my ontological inquiry, which is precisely asking what does it mean to have a history if we want to understand time, and time in relationship to matter, relationship to objects. But there is one point in your whole argumentation, I think there is an ontological relevance. And I would like to point you out to that. From my point of view, the most interesting question of the birth of modern historical science is not the fact that historians were more concerned with written for sources or objective sources, but the fact that Ranke and Niebuhr introduces the question of authentication as the primal condition of historical knowledge whatsoever. So what authentication means? Critique of sources. What does it mean that we need to have a criticism over sources and authentify them in order to use it as a possible source for historical information? That means we have documents from the 17th century. A letter which says that the noble had a property here and there. What we need to do as a historian is to find out if this text is authentic or not. What authentic means? Authentic means that this text belongs to that very period that it assumes or claims to have appeared, to belong to. And we as a historian need to understand that this text in my hand is a material object, belongs to a certain time, belongs to a certain space authentically. In compared to the fake documents, which only says that this happened, but it's not, it was made yesterday or 10 years ago. Well, the authentication means that you need to understand that an object belonged to a certain time and to a certain space. And this criteria of objectivity and authentication is an ontological precondition in order to make valid historical judgment about the content, textual content of the text. So in this same, through the authentication process, what you have is an object and its temporality at the first place, regardless of the content. And you need to authentify it from historical means. Very simple ontological gesture. You as a historian have to relate an object to a certain time. If it belongs to that, you can prove it, because you can prove it by the material of the paper, of the vocabulary of the words, of the stamp which is on the side. You can you can X-ray all kind of material processes. You can authentify document. Once you have it, then you can acquire the historical content of the document. Now this gesture of authentication and critique of sources, it is the birth moment of historical sciences, and it has an absolute ontological significance. It's precisely what I'm talking about, that objects has a certain history on their own. They belong to another time. It's not your time. They belong to another space. They be created at a certain point of time and living, and have the marks of this time that they spent in existing on their own structure. So this is, I think, the ontological precondition that you can have any kind of historical consciousness whatsoever in the modern and scientific sense. And I'm interested in this very project. What does it mean that an object belongs to a certain time? In its material configuration, not in its content. That's my opinion, that's what it says. What does it mean that this paper were created, I don't know, 2.5 years ago in a print office? What does it mean that this object belongs to that time? And this object belongs to another time. And this object can be destroyed and forget forever. Other objects still will existing for another 100 and 200 years. What does it mean that objects have their own temporality with regard about your opinion? Because precisely this is what historical facticity is. That you have information that you can prove that they belong to a certain historical period. But this is an ontological moment, at the same time a moment of birth of modern historical science. So for me, this is the interesting point. Everything else follows from this. If you don't have this precondition, you don't have historical knowledge, you don't have historical consciousness.
Basically, they have to be temporal to be historical, but we could not deduce from their temporality their historicity. This is what I want to say.
We cannot deduce.
We could not jump from their temporality to their historicity. Their
Of course we can.
temporality is just a precondition to be historical. But
It depends on the perspective. Depends on the perspective.
There is no historicity of the nature things.
Precisely.
I mean,
Mr.
it's history, Geschichte. How can you say that there is a historicity of this? I mean, or of this computer, there is a
Maybe you
scripture.
should kill me that with me.
But no, at this point it's a question of terms and categories, what we mean by historicity.
Yeah, of course.
Again, I mean it in an ontological way, not in a cultural way. What I might claim is that in order to have a cultural sense of historicity, you have this underlying structure of ontological historicity, which means that objects and objective configuration has their own temporality on their own level, independent of the human unconscious mind.
Okay.
That's a basic primitive fact.
Let's add the revolution. Yeah, what can wrong? That's okay. I mean.
Okay. No, the thing is that I think that implicitly this is always presupposing all kind of historical consciousness, cultural or scientific.
Based on that.
Based on ontological presupposition. My question is, let's understand this ontological presupposition and categorize on their own level, and then maybe we have new perspective to understand what historicity is on the cultural level. And what is historical consciousness whatsoever? And maybe it is linked also not to textual source but your embodiment. And maybe it is not subjective because it's intersubjective, and maybe it's cultural. So my thinking is that why not start from the ground, let time and matter be constituted, and then go up and say again the same question: how far we can get if we take this basic ontological facticity as granted and want to understand everything else that follows from it.
Yes. But your claim. This your claim, your ground claim, should be supported with another claim. What's the connection between subject and that objectivity? I mean,
of course. No. I'm coming there. I'm responding to Olga's, right? Olga's question in a second. But what is this? But first of all, this is what I'm going to do. That this is an ontological project which wants to define first the relationship between meaning and matter, and then when it's done, let's say it's done, then they say what else coming out of it at all the level of historical knowledge or subjectivity, historical formation, and historical culture whatsoever. And I think what we had so far in theories is precisely the opposite way. We had a kind of theory of historicity, and then we attached to it certain theory of materiality, like Ricoeur, like, hey, it's interesting, it's a trace of the past. So, but what is interesting, Ricoeur, is not that it's ontological condition of the past object, but the epistemological and hermeneutical issue that comes up for historical consciousness. I don't deny its validity. I'm just wanting to say that maybe we can go deeper and see what is the ontological grounding for all these operations. And from this point of view, my ally science is not history; it's archaeology. Archaeology is all about matter and time. The whole history of archaeology is dealing with this question in more and more theoretical, sophisticated way. What does it mean that certain objects belong to a certain time, and how can we do that, and what kind of information is that? Contemporary archaeology is so sophisticated, theoretical and philosophically, using, by the way, phenomenology a lot, that I read that more than phenomenological works on temporal and historical because they're much more exciting. When they ask the question, what is an archaeological fact? How is it related to temporality? How is it related to memory? What does it mean that different layers of materiality has their own temporality, which determines one another, at the same time giving us indication about the temporality of that thing independently of my temporal apprehension of chronological time? Many questions are posed in archaeology about all these questions with matter and time focused primarily. and deducing from it all the cultural significance and all the culturally interesting things, which are obviously not secondary, but from ontological level, they situated elsewhere than this grounding question.
But we are speaking here about some sort of stratified reality. You have one plane, this is, for example, plane of nature, plane of matter, etc., and we have another plane, it's plane of history. But the problem is how you are moving from one to another.
It's not the
to analyze, we have this wind and this Philip II, and this Philip II using this wind, and we have this historical fact, and as something historical, Philip's usage of wind and its consequences. But wind by itself is just a temporal. It's not still historical. What is the moment when wind becomes historical? When Philip starts to use this wind, and when we are telling stories about Philip's using the wind, sailing the seas, etc. This is what we want to move from another.
First of all, it doesn't necessarily have to be a hierarchical theory. Brodel had a hierarchical structure. I'm not necessarily. I'm not saying that matter and nature comes first, and then I don't know, subjectivity comes second, and intersubjectivity third. I'm not saying these are hierarchical. I think they exist at the same level at the same time. I'm discerning those elements out of this very complex network of subjective, intersubjective, and material processes, which concern precisely the relationship between time and matter. And I want to discern these in order to understand their role in the constitution of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. I'm not saying they're hierarchical. It's not the grounding theorem I'm doing. What I'm saying is that so far, we did not maybe pay enough attention to the fact that there are material elements in all these kind of cultural formation that have been so much dealt in the past 200 years in human science, social sciences. But except the notion of, except the archaeology and geology, which they're all sciences of their own, these questions never have been dealt with from an epistemological ontological point of view. So I'm trying to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a hierarchy. What concerns the wind as a purely material phenomenon which has no history, I would refer to Lucien Febvre's book of the history of the climate. Okay, so wind is not just wind. Wind doesn't blow at the same time all the time. The climate has its own history, and the climate's history is not human history. How the wind blows, how the rain rains, how the sun shines, that's its own temporality. That's precisely when the cosmological dimension comes into the fore. And you can write the history of the climate. You know, I mean, today it's better. There's climate change. For Brodel, it was a long-duration process, you know, in 1,000 years. But he presumed that the geological and natural conditions has their own historicity, and precisely what kind of made the Mediterranean sphere significant from this point of view. There was a lucky period in time when the sun shined in the right way, the wind blown from the right way to cross the Atlantic by ships and not vice versa, and allowed the culture to establish and utilize these material elements which has their own temporality, and which, as you know right now, changes radically, and maybe will not recognized climatically and geographically the same word as we recognize it today in 10 years' time, or 20 or 50 years' time. So of course the wind has its own history. Of course it's a historical phenomenon. Of course it's nothing had to do with human temporality.
Can I just abuse it 2 or 3 minutes just for one comment, one more question? First, when we are speaking about history or Geschichte, we are speaking about something happening and about telling a story. There is double meaning. And who is telling a story about nature? We are telling a story about nature. If we have a natural history, it's natural history because this is a story, telling a story about nature, not because nature has something intrinsically historical in itself.
You're not navigating to a very dangerous epistemological position. You know, that's idealism and basically advocating.
One more thing.
So if you cannot say a story that it doesn't exist, or what?
No. That does not mean that does not.
So what do you mean? So why the story is important? Why the telling the story is important?
A narrative element from history from the objective element from history, and we need to account for a material specific narrative, not just written on paper. But if we want to tackle these issues, I think that we need to answer the questions: what is the material status of narratives as narratives?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying too.
But not just documents, not just books, but narratives. And I do not know how to answer this question, so I'm just pinpointing. The question more practical than epistemological. If we turn history only to archaeology, only to objective history, Does it mean that we will then sacrifice history only to the science of history? That means that for which Benjamin told us that history reduced to the objectivity will, for example, will lose its traditional functions. Yes. We could not hear the stories from victims, for example. There could be no historical messianism. There could be no myriad of historical functions of telling stories which are history. Does it mean reduction to scientific moment, or does it mean just specific focus of your phenomenological approach to scientific moment?
The question is crucial. It's all about meaning, formation, and matter. But I'm not concerned about the function of history and the role of narrativity. I don't privilege this. They don't have a privilege, by the way, at all. You know, the fact that we are telling stories is a very particular cultural phenomenon happening in European culture. Other cultures don't have that. If you go to China, they don't tell stories. You know what? Chinese culture does not belong and does not. Their own historical knowledge does not rely on the fact of narrativity. You know what they have instead? Objects and inscriptions. Calligraphic writing is a material, written inscription on other material. You know what? They don't tell a story. They have a jade, dates back from 10,000 years BC. A jade little statue, and that tells its own story. They don't need to repeat it. They don't need to write it down. They don't need to memorize their own stories. Everything is inscribed in Asian culture and Chinese culture in the very object they live in. You know, so we have different perspective, much more materialistic from this point of view, much more closer to my ontological perspective in Asia than in Europe. So why privilege this narrativity, this very peculiar European phenomenon? I see its cultural relevance. I don't see its ontological relevance. Except when we ask the question, what's the relationship between meaning, formation, and materiality? My claim is between every kind of possible meaning formations, there's a material precondition that has been met in every possible theory and act of history, namely recognizing the irreversibility of time. And the irreversibility of time is a material issue, not a spiritual issue.
We have Chinese chroniclers, we
Sorry?
have Chinese written records, we have Chinese histories. History that does not mean it needs to be a nice story. That does not mean to be there were once upon a time, there were one king, etc., etc. This could be this year, this and that. And this is narrative.
Of course it's a narrative, but it's a narrative that has not the same cultural function than in our country. They don't need to say stories. The narrative is ostensive in the structure of the thing. A jade structure, a jade little figure tells everything for a Chinese. The same way as a calligraphic writing without the meaning, because the calligraphic writing has changed, the shape changed through time. So from a shape they can immediately see which period belongs. That very act of writing, independent of the context. All I'm saying is that there are cultures when history is visible more than narrative, in a way that the objects that they worship from a historical point of view tell their own story, represent their own history, you know? And there's a material element in it.
And there's no story, as you say, they're narratives, they're stories.
Yeah, I mean, if you wish, I mean, I'm not against about narrative. All I'm saying is that this narrativity, all kind of narrative is grounded in the material preconditions of a certain object and a certain material issue belonging to a certain time. And for me, this belonging is the precondition for any kind of possible stories that you can say in the name of history. Because you can invent histories, right? You can say whatever you want, you can imagine histories. Why don't you do that? Why don't we just invent our entire fucking past? Because there's a requirement that certain time has passed and you cannot simply falsify it. You cannot simply neglect it. Why not? Why not invent a brand new culture from scratch?
About history, we could speak then about temporality and about past.
That's exactly
and we could eliminate history from this.
We could, yeah, you're right, we could.
That way.
We could easily eliminate history at a certain level, and then maybe we should ask ourselves in what way related to what we know as history to this temporal. And if you see that this one is precondition for the other, then maybe you want to get back to the notion of history. But yes, on the grounding level, we could neglect history and not talk about history. We talk about time and matter. That's what I did in my text. I abandoned for a certain time the question of historicity and asked the question about the notion of irreversibility and rigid time. And I repeat, irreversibility exists only at the material level. In consciousness, in mind, if you wish, in your mind, there is no irreversibility. On the contrary, you have retroaction, memory, and forgetting everything. But that's how I distinguish between.
During psychological reflection, not in practice.
Sorry?
Only during thinking, not in practice. That doesn't eliminate historical practice, eliminate telling stories. Make not legitimate practice of telling stories. You just want to say that we could, on the ontological level, eliminate history, speak only about temporality and about past. This is what we want to say.
Eliminate means we don't necessarily need the category of history to understand time and matter. At the same time, why not? If it fits into this conditioning order. I mean, yes. I mean, my aim is to arrive at the point where I can make valid claims about history and historicity based on this ontological work that I'm about to do on temporality and materiality. And it seems to me it's promising. I mean, you understand precisely. You understand what the difference between history in a proper sense and imagined story and story. Story. History is something which refers back to an underlying irreversible temporal structure. Now here we come back to the notion of subjectivity. I don't eliminate subjectivity, that's what I'm saying here.
Yes. Okay, we understand.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that we need to maybe understand subjectivity better if we abandon the perspective only from phenomenological point of view, which is necessarily, by definition, linked to the perspective of experience. So for me, it's not enough to say that we have a passivity, we have affectivity, and we have sensibility towards the material world. I think it's not enough to say that it is co-constituted. We need to be more radical than that. Objects, because the objects that they have their own structure, which are obviously affecting us, but their own structure cannot be described from the point of view of the human passivity, affectivity, and sensibility. That's my claim is that contact between the physical contact, if you want to use this word, between two objects cannot be adequately described, saying that, oh, these two objects are passive. Oh, no, what is active? Oh, it's affecting one another. That's our experimental categories which don't fit into understanding what is it. At the same time, you are bodily involved in this, the same business. Your body has not only affectivity, but contact that you don't feel. Your entire set of organs inside your body are contact very literally to one another. Organically linked through context. Do you feel it? Do you feel your lung right now? Do you feel, maybe you feel your heart if you really focus on it. Do you feel your, I don't know, your muscles in a way as it contacts your bones? You don't. Do they have a contact? Of course they have. Does it belong essentially to your bodily constitution? Of course it does. Does it affect your subjectivity? Yes, through the movement and through everything you do. So what I'm saying is that there is a limit from which subjective point of view can reach notion of materiality, and there's a point where you need to switch to another category and analyze these issues on their own level and invent a new categorization which rests under the control of experience. That's why what I'm doing is not speculative realism. That's why what I'm doing is not the scientific theory. You could describe the body from a medical point of view, and talk about medical constitution. The notion of constitution is used in medicine to describe the internal structure of the body. You could do that, but I don't want to, because my point of view is still, as you pointed out, linked to experience and subjectivity, which means that I want to understand in what way these objective and material configurations make sense. But it doesn't mean that you can reuse them back to the subjectivity for whom these processes make sense. So that's where I'm saying that you have indications, and you need to follow the indication and analyze the ontological categories on their own level, and abandoning from a heuristic point of view, subjectivity. And then maybe come back to a subjectivity when you understood the logic of the things that are happening outside independent of subjectivity. So my theory is precisely, yes, understanding how the subjective is constituted. And I think that there's very little being done from a phenomenological point of view on that. Foucault and Deleuze, of course, they have said a lot about this. But from a phenomenological point of view, and for that matter from an ontological point of view, see, there's a lot to do, especially about embodiment and materiality and temporality is involved. And here we're coming back to your question, relationship between meaning and matter. But it seems to me precisely that matter you don't mean in a material way. You mean it in a cultural way. But cultural matter is an interesting thing, That's what cultural sciences do when they talk about the material culture. Every object has it's not an object, but every object has a value. And their materiality and their facticity shine through the values and the social functions which they are coded to in the logic of subjective and intersubjective and life world, if you want, activities. But it's precisely that's the point. That's the blank point of phenomenological theories, and in fact neo-Kantian theories too, except the work of Emil Lask, who was very, very far in his first work on Fichte to understanding the relationship between signifying and meaning and materiality. But Lask said that there is and I'm recalling the neo-Kantian framework because Gumbrich and Kekler is very much into neo-Kantian way at least in a tradition, to understand culture as a meaningful and material process at the same time. So there is some German tradition in there which is not phenomenological, but I think goes back more to the Neo-Kantian tradition.
Nietzsche.
Sorry?
Nietzsche.
And Nietzsche too, precisely, but they're not far as radical as Nietzsche in their way. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it's not enough to say that that objects are usually, even in their materiality, are wrapped up and embedded into cultural values and meaning. You need to understand what is in an object which resists to any kind of meaning formation. What is in an object which on its own level generates meaning formation, and not let any meaning arbitrarily be developed with regard to a certain object. And that's where the notion of facticity, more than simple social affectivity, when it is rooted in the very material conditions of life and death, the fact that you will die, it's not a simple cultural issue. It is also a material issue, and it determines everything. For Heidegger, death is a cultural issue. You know, it happens with existence. Does it happen with the body for Heidegger? Not at all. You see, I mean, if you take the material elements out of all these basic factical issues from life and death, what you have is precisely the cultural processes and the historical processes, and in general, narrativity. I think it's far not enough and not satisfying to describe our universe from a cultural point of view, no matter how deep you go into address the question of technology and artificial things. If you don't understand the material nature and the way they force you to accord a certain meaning, they compels you to do something. These objects compels you. You cannot form any meaning, neither subjectively nor culturally about them. And if you don't understand that what are those facts in life and the world, which cannot be altered because of their material resistant nature, then you won't understand precisely why a culture and why intersubjectivity and culture happen in one way, not another. So I think here we come back to the notion of historicity. I think material historicity is more than the material existence of values. It has its own ontological level, and I think what you need to understand is the way it is related to time and temporality. And that's the key. That's when it really goes, I think, back about the physicalist description of the world, or about the sheer ontological description of the world. When you understand that matter is not dead matter, inert matter, but matter is always temporally changing matter. Matter is always marked by temporality. You can provide I will provide the definition of matter as the following: matter is everything which can be marked by temporal change. That's matter. Matter is everything which can be in structure or surface, marked, inscribed by the fact that it is temporally changing. In this sense, consciousness is not matter, because consciousness is, in fact, consciousness doesn't age. You know, doesn't mark by time. Consciousness produces time in a way basically as it wants to. You know, we have pathological form of consciousness which doesn't experience time at all, full presence or full past. That's what matter never does. There's no presence for matter. There's no such a thing as present. There's all for matter what exists always is temporal transfiguration, temporal time, and it is marked on the structure. It is marked on the matter. It's always visible. Something has happened with a certain material configuration. I think that's a very interesting ontological fact and facticity. And maybe if you look after it, analyze it, you will understand a lot of new things about how subjectivity works, how body works, how culture works, how historicity is constituted. So that's my project. Reverse the whole issue and try to go through this path from an angle that I think that had not been traversed so far in a sufficient way.
We have 5 interventions left. Do you think we need a break, or let's just go?
Yeah, let's make a pause.
Okay.
You don't know him, right?
Okay, Serjan, Igor, and myself.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this thought-provoking lecture. I have 2 short interventions. Namely, I'm a sociologist, but I also am a pragmatist, so I really find that this whole idea of realist, materialist interpretation of phenomenology is quite good, and in a sense it flows actually from some of the stuff that was done in pragmatism. For example, pragmatist account of the environment stresses that it's a milieu, it's not quite, it's something intermediate. So what you said, what we heard today, it seems to me, I'd like to hear more explicitly what you think about pragmatism especially Julian variation pragmatism, which essentially stresses the same point that you stressed, that we need to approach human interaction and human action from the standpoint of politics. So that's a side question. But I was wondering if we accept this realist and also material position that you advocate, then do we need to immediately reimagine our understanding of human agency? So, sure. If objects have their ontological sovereignty, which is separated from the subjectivity, and if you modify it, then you fall close actually to something like Bruno Latour's actor network theory, perhaps, but you are trying to push phenomenology towards that end, it seems. I'm not saying that it's bad, but I mean that we have to reflect about what this position, holistic or materialistic, implies in regards to human action today. Yeah. If I, as a sociologist, wanted to adopt your position, what should I do in my reason? So that's the first question. And the second goes to the tricky story about documents, history. Namely, I'm trying to put myself in a position of someone who is doing archaeology, who is following material phenomenology 300 years from now. But he wouldn't look at documents and stuff like that, because most of the documents today produced are essentially hypercognitive. They are documents found on servers or I don't know where. So if, for instance, if you look at this document, if you look at what is described here, you will deduce that it was printed like 5 minutes ago, which is false. I mean, it was printed, but it was written like 10 days ago, I don't know, it doesn't matter. So I was thinking about the story that you say, the main claim that you want to see material memory, inscription, stuff like that, stuff that comes from recur. I was thinking about how can we apply this to I don't know, the way that we are going to do history in the future. So yeah, so that's the two questions.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, yeah? Oh yeah, you go, all right. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ádám, for the lecture, especially for this introduction that was, for me, probably even more interesting. I have to say that I share actually your idea to make a phenomenological, more realistic way. I'm probably a bit more skeptical if we actually could explain in somewhat so easy relation to the object and how the object is so material for us. But I will not talk about it. Just one brief comment on your introduction. On one you said that Husserl, Realist, and their cogitation and Leibniz and Heidegger. You mentioned that it probably came from Kant. It's, I think, important to notice that Kant, in contrast to whole rationalistic tradition, let's say, despiritualized Empfindungen, in a means that Empfindungen are not souls. Leibniz, Wolff, Meyer, Baumgarten all define Empfindungen as cogitations, and Kant exactly that they are not cogitation. I'm not sure for Husserl, but it's important that Kant say that there is something real, and in Empfindungen he means very explicitly on how the other object affect us, but not still cognize the object, and that is not a cogitation. About facticity, the general question is how do you understand facticity in this text? We know that there is an existentialistic position. I know that Merleau has his own theory about it, so I don't know much about Merleau. But what was interesting to me when I read it, I saw that you, many places you insist on emphasizing the Latin term factum. And I'm myself researching something about it, working something on Kant, but also with some text I am better at publishing on Kant. This word that it obviously came from factere, and that's factum, so factum literally means something done. not how we use it today. And in legal theory, it has the meaning of a deed, of something done, not something that is truth-making, but something that should be preceded with additional evidence to see what it that deed. And it came in the natural science step by step, first as effect of experiment, which is actually some deed, something done, and then later in 17th century became something we are talking today about Tatsache, or something that is intersubjectively easy to see. By Kant there is clearly different between factum physica, which is natural fact, and factum practica, which is action of free agent. So my question here, because in some moments I think that this understanding of facts in history as deeds have a reference to actually what modern understanding of history is, that there are subjects who done it, and that is how we make stories. But I think that there is something in the way you are working with facts that it is not just simple fact, real fact, but it has something to do more in practice, in line with Marxian vision of materialism. So I would like to hear more about it. And the second question, which is probably dead end, but I will try to give my intuition. When I said yesterday when you spoke about that I looked a little bit at analytic epistemology. When I gave the text about facts in Kant and social facts to a friend of mine who is working in materialistic epistemology, she said that they avoid generally to use the term fact, and it is speaking about state of affairs. State of affairs are those, in contrast to fact, they can attain or not attain. For example, I would say it is now in seminary in Budapest is possible state affair, but it is not fact because I am not in Budapest. And one of the reasons, obviously, why they try to do that, because of materialistic faith that only scientists can actually say to us what is fact and what is not, and that is not actually a real object of philosophizing. And I think that there is some, I'm not materialistic epistemology, I like to talk of philosophize about facts, but I think there is an ambiguity in your work. At some moment you wanted to speak about how the science is working, how the archaeology is working, but also trying to philosophize about fact, which natural epistemology could never do. So I finished this question with the question, is probably what you're doing in some way. For example, Husserl tried to make thesis that there are social facts, which are actual facts, and they're not factum brutum really, but they are facts which are not relative to this fact, but still facts, and we have to philosophize how these facts are different in kind. In some way you are saying that there are historiographical facts, and these facts are different in kinds from the fact we have in usual natural science, or we have in social fact, and that is probably the reason why we should learn for historiography and why philosophers should work with historiographers to explain the special status of this fact.
Okay. Firstly, I want to draw some parallels between what you do and certain contemporary tendencies. Even though in your text you distance yourself from speculative realism, from Graham Harmony, I think it is worth mentioning that in contemporary new realisms, the very concept of historicity plays a crucial role. Of course, I am first and foremost referring to Quentin Meillassoux concept of ancestrality and arc fossils, as it appears in his magnum opus Après la finitude. As it is well known, Meillassoux suggests that the scientifically realist account of ancestral statements refer to a reality prior to the emergence of consciousness, such as a statement that the date or the origin of the universe is at approximately 13 billion years ago. Merleau suggests that statements like this one reveal a diachronicity, a temporal lag between the world and our relation to the world. So they break the so-called correlationist circle. I think these speculations, this speculative materialism seems to be very close to what you suggest. And Merleau also uses the word facticity and factuality as you do. And it is also well known that contemporary realists confront with Bruno Latour's claim that Ramses II could not have died of tuberculosis any more than from being killed by automatic weapons, since neither tuberculosis nor automatic weapons were known in ancient Egypt. Again, the realist criticism with regard to the Latourian conclusions seem to be very close to what you say about the sovereignty of historical reality. And maybe we should mention Paradis and Takács as well, their work on documentality. In your text you mentioned the early Jacques Derrida as one of the exceptions concerning the phenomenological style engagement with the question of historicity. It might be interesting for you that there are certain strongly realist and materialist readings of Derridian philosophy. It's not only Catherine Malabou who works on this. She tries to elaborate the materialist conceptualization of the trace. She introduces the concept of plasticity in order to grasp the generality of the trace beyond the mere graphic trace, grasp matter's capacity to give and receive form, its historicity in fact. But there is also the work of Deborah Goldgaber, who tries to present the deconstructive materialism that is connected with contemporary debates in speculative realism and new materialism. She does this by showing that Derrida was speaking of the generality of grammar, from genetic inscription to programmatic chains regulating the behavior of the amoeba or the annelid. There is an anti-materiality of the trace. That's what she suggests. Needless to say, this is also very similar to what you say about the trace, the vestige, ruin, document, testimony, and so on. All in all, I think it might be useful to compare your insights with these wider realist tendencies, despite of your reservations with regard to Heidegger, who is really a special case. I'm very sympathetic to your claims that history is a universal horizon upon which everything that has ever come into being is based, and that we need a desubjectivization and pluralization of time. I think that this opens a new space for non-human, to use a contemporary buzzword, a post-human perspective. I think that in this respect, the theory of dynamic systems and complexity might enrich your theoretical framework significantly in a very, very productive way. Let me quote Paul Cdier's definition of complexity. It says, complex systems have a history. They evolve and their past is co-responsible for their present behavior. Let me quote another essay by Cliff Hooker. The title is Introduction to the Philosophy of Complex Systems. He enumerates the most important characteristics of complexity, and among them mentions path, dependence, and historicity. I quote, examples include a particular impurity site of first freezing or of rolling boiling, a first genetic mutation that yields a distinctive kind of adaptive advantage, or a first oil discovery, or shot in a new suburb that transforms the local economy. These cases exhibit a clear sense of historical possibilities exploited and correlatively of others foregone, and their resulting paths are often said to fix their initial historical conditions. Given that you aim to conceptualize historicity by rethinking the constitution of temporality as such, maybe you should also rely upon dynamic systems theory. As you mentioned, the thesis on I think in your text you mentioned factical irreversibility and material memory, and in that respect, the theory of Yuria Prigozhin and Isabel Stengers, which emphasizes precisely irreversible processes and presents new theory of the arrow of time. So I think their theory would be really, really useful for what you do. And let me give a final example with regard to complexity and historicity. Complexity theoreticians use the expression stigmary intelligence in order to conceptualize the network mechanisms of indirect coordination. The principle is that the trace left in the environment by an action stimulates the performance of a network action by the same or agent or by a different agent. And stigmology was first observed in social insects. For example, ants exchange information by laying down pheromones, the trace, on their way back to the nest when they have found. In that way, they collectively develop a complex network of trails connecting the nest in an efficient way to various food resources. And when ants come out of the nest searching for food, they are stimulated by the pheromone to follow the trail towards the food source. The network of trails function as a shared external memory for the ant colony. I think that the reflection of these phenomena could also be very interesting for what you do. Finally, I have 4 questions for you. At the end of the text, you claim that your historical phenomenology would be anchored on a realist and materialist project. Now, as it is well known, realism and materialism are not the same. To put it simply, every materialist necessarily has to be a realist, but not every realist is a materialist. For instance, the already mentioned Harman is today an explicit anti-materialist, but he is still a realist, or I think the same goes for Marcus Gabriel, who has an over-epistemologized realism, but still he is not a materialist. So my question is, how do you see this difference between materialism and realism in regard to what you do? Second question, obviously you dismantle the phenomenological project in many ways. Your text dissects phenomenology in multiple ways. You criticize the transcendental framework, the overemphasis on subjectivity in consciousness. So after all these interventions, I have this banal question, okay, but why do you still prefer phenomenology? Why don't you just simply use a completely different framework? I don't know, realistic one, a complexivist one. I don't know, but why do you still think that we need phenomenology, at least as a probability? This question is quite banal, but it fascinates me. Third question, I think there is a renewal of panpsychism, which is quite relevant for your conclusions, because I think it is an entirely different strategy. New panpsychists suggest that we leave phenomenology behind, but precisely by radicalizing phenomenology, by suggesting that everything is experience. What happens between two objects is also an experience. Experience is not just a human phenomenon. We shouldn't reduce it to mere human things. This is obviously a different strategy from yours, and I would like to know what would you say about it. And my final very short question. At the end of your text, you claim material historicity nurtures perhaps the only idea of radical transcendence capable of challenging the idea of a God. Why is so?
Why what so? Why do I mention this, or why do I believe this?
Why do you think that by this method we can leave the idea of God behind? Because that's what you suggest, right? Okay.
All right. Well, so it seems to me that these 3 questions again are linked with a very internal kind of acts, and this basically probably they weren't like just accidentally assembled. And this goes back to the second question you posed. I think it's all, why do I use phenomenology as a framework for this project? And this is a crucial question, obviously. And basically, why do I use phenomenology? Could be translated, why don't I use other theories, system theories that I mentioned? Why don't I use deconstructive? Why don't I rely more on or new realist project? In what way what I do is imply the notion of factum or fact and facticity is also in a way concern the usage of certain terms I do, and I prefer obviously phenomenological meaning. And finally, it goes back to my relationship to lateral social theory and the very interesting question of basically virtual dimension of human experience. Now, I think that's a question I usually got when I present. So I'm more and more sensitive. And I'm asking myself also, what's the role of phenomenology here? And this presentation I just gave, I tried to kind of justify why I do think that, whereas it's true that you can do realism and materialism in many, many ways, different ways, I still think the phenomenological framework offers a suitable and feasible theoretical horizon to address all these questions. And this is basically the question of, if I want to do something which is like a pure theory, so is it a theory of what exactly, time and matter and I don't know, history, or I want more than simply do a simple theory. And I think phenomenology is more than a simple theory. Phenomenology is not. Phenomenology is, if I privilege phenomenology, it's because phenomenology always refers back to the field of experience through which certain things can be justified or falsified. And I need this control precisely in order to keep an eye on the theoretical consequences of my research. And I need an internal process of justification, if you wish, evidence, to which I can simply point out in certain moments and say that, hey, this is what I'm talking about. This is not a pure theory, which could be like anything. It could be even a scientific theory or a historical theory. But this is something which happens to us. It concerns us in a way. It's our world I'm talking about. Even when I'm talking about different ontological categories that lacks human mediation, human constitution on their own level, I think you still need to maintain phenomenology in order to have an epistemic and epistemological control over what you do in theory. And since I was trained in phenomenology, and I was very sensitive to something which is since long died out of phenomenology, and it's not very much a topical issue since 50, 60 years, the question of the notion of evidence. In Husserl, I wrote my thesis on my second part of my thesis, which has not been published, is on Husserl's notion of evidence and internal justification. And you know, it's very interesting to see that how the notion of, to carry the notion of evidence is played in the development of phenomenological thinking. People have forgotten it. Like, for Husserl, it's a crucial, most important thing that when you say something as a phenomenologist, you need to have evidence. You need to have an argument and evidence for it. Even as Heidegger is in the beginning of time, what Heidegger called the existential witnessing of certain of his argumentation is basically repeating this gesture of justification. Now, I still want to keep this gesture and not do simple theories and not just theorize on the universe, which can be anything, you know, and you can rely on many theories that you not mentioned and which can be also comparable to my project. From neo-Kantianism through Nikolai Hartmann's to various Marxist theories, you could make an even longer list. What is possibly can have a connection to my work. Precisely, there's a point when you need to kind of decide what you do, and this decision can be simply arbitrary or heuristic. You cannot simply integrate elements that you most easily comes into your theory and make a big whole of it. I see the phenomenology is compelling. It's compelling because it always asks the question that what does it mean and how does it relate to human experience? And you need to keep this question alive in order to have an epistemological and methodological control over what you do. So for this heuristic purpose, I keep phenomenology and phenomenological perspective simply simply for having an experimental and justificatory gesture in this project, which at the same time also works as a selection, principle of selection, what I read and what I incorporate into my theory, and what I don't read and don't use in my research. It's heuristic, but obviously heuristic in a phenomenological sense means justification, method, evidence or basis. And this is what I don't find among all the theories that you mentioned, no matter how I sympathize with them. They have a different kind of heuristic or different kind of methodology and epistemological engagement that that I don't want to follow because their criteria is not fits into my own intuition, to my own conceptuality. So phenomenology, I still use it because I think that when we do philosophy, human experience, or if you wish, subjectivity, should be a major issue, and which is related to human experience and subjectivity or intersubjectivity. Well, even those elements which are non-human or post-human or under or upper human can have a true philosophical and not scientific value. So I don't know if it's satisfying this answer or not, but that's why I use phenomenology and select certain theories that are reliable and certain not. From this point of view, deconstruction is very much fits into my category. I mean, you know Derrida's history about phenomenology and his notion of trace and notion of inscription is very much linked not only materialism, you know, as you mentioned, but to certain phenomenological origins and intuitions that come handy for my own project. Staying at the Derrida's level, my major reference points basically two Derridians, which you didn't mention. One of them is Julia Kristeva and her Revolution of Poetic Language, of which the first chapter is about materialism, matter and meaning, signifying practices and materiality. You read that it's a very well developed Marxist, Leninist, and Derridian theory. What does it mean to be materialist when it comes to analyze meaning formations and signifying, as what Kristeva calls signifying practices. The other Derridian I rely secretly, and I'm simply pronouncing it, Jean-Luc Nancy is a realist and a materialist. You know, read his book on contact, on the body, the core. He's very much beyond my project. I had the chance and the luck to discuss person by person with Nancy all these issues, and we really like basic, if I can make. I mean, he agreed what do I do. All the notion of contact and temporality of matter, he really liked it very much. So I had the personal confirmation that I'm in agreement with what he does, even though he does it in a more rhetorical way and a kind of poetic way, which I'm by spiritual constitution not very much able to do myself. My text is far from being poetic, that's for sure. So that's my relation to new realism. Yes, obviously there's overlapping elements, but there's one thing that I don't find in them, which is crucial, neither Harman nor Meillassoux nor Ferraris, is addressing the problem of time as such. They use the time as a sub-model for their speculations, but they don't provide themselves. What does it mean that you have a realist or materialist conception of time? And I think that's where I see their shortcoming, and that's where I try to replace by a phenomenologically informed material temporality of time. So that's where I part ways mostly from these theories. Though the God, that's obviously a rhetorical question at the end. At the same time, this is also a demarcating gesture for contemporary French phenomenology, which, as you know, understood since Levinas, or even the late Husserl, if you wish, radical transcendence as something which is divine. Now, I think material temporality is precisely nothing have to do with divinity or any kind of God, because it includes a basic fact, and I come back to the notion of fact, the death in the structure. What I'm talking about is death. My major problem is death. What does it mean? Things end radically, brutally, irreversibly. Things end that they're never gonna go back. Never gonna be the same ever. That happens in the level of materiality. Only. That's why it is not God, because God cannot die. So that's where the whole question of destruction, death, but also borning and having something new becomes a crucial ontological element at this material level. In this sense, this is very atheist project I'm trying to do, knowing that in contemporary phenomenology it's precisely the opposite tendency is à la mode, understanding transcendence as basically spiritual, and once you understand it spiritually, the further step is related to something which is about us and about the universe. Though I really want to do not want to make that gesture by no means. Well, the question of fact and facticity is a crucial thing, but I'm afraid this is not crucial in my own project. I think I can get rid of the notion of fact and facticity. I mean them first and foremost in a phenomenological way. So facticity is Husserl's and Heidegger's notion of facticity, and fact is basically Heidegger's factum, which means that the ineluctable effective presence of certain phenomena that you cannot get away with, cannot get away without. You cannot eliminate them from your philosophical analysis. This is the phenomenological meaning of fact and facticity. Obviously, gives some more because this also refers to affectivity. But that's what Husserl and Heidegger means by factum. Something which needs to be addressed in your theory of experience. And precisely to avoid the ambiguity of this notion that it can be social fact, it can be scientific fact, it can be transcendental fact, it can be empirical fact. It seems to me that I'm gradually getting rid of the notion of fact and factuality, maybe keeping the facticity when it comes to analyzing history, but not on the ontological category. I absolutely understand your reservations, and I feel these reservations too. This is an unclear notion, and I don't really think the way how could you enrich it and sufficiently pump it up with unambiguous ontological meaning. So probably I will just forget about using the notion of fact. That's my answer. So the same with the very interesting topic. So I need to emphasize that I'm not that level yet. So I don't know what's going to happen if I go through with my argument and arrive analyzing the social issues. I also get this question very often, but I just don't have an answer. I don't know what will happen when we go analyze materiality, temporality, apply it to subjectivity, and then intersubjectivity, and arrive finally to the level of analyzing sociality in terms of material processes of that sort. If it will fit into Bruno's Latour's object or agency theory or not. Certainly the human agency is a crucial problem for me, and you pointed out very well that I'm looking for something which goes beyond the human agency, or which divides and dismantles human agent as a one singular kind of ontological drive. I have an analysis of my body which based on these philosophical premises, and I came to a conclusion that your body has not one single agency. So it's human, but it can be meant at least 3 or 4 different meaning and different ontological structure. Your own human body is not one agency. It operates at least 3 or 4 different levels, which means that the human agency is multiplied in a way, and they don't have the same function. They don't have the same meaning. They have the role they don't have the same role in the social constitutions either. So. I think the body, for me, the body is the key for the human issue and for the subjectivity. And I think if you take the body seriously, and take the body seriously in its material configuration, and not simply understand it as a living, not simply organic, as a living kind of entity, which can be affected and can be passive and can be touching and can be moving. So if you abandon the classical phenomenological framework of understanding body, which is basically a moving, effective, living entity, and if you incorporate the true materiality and immateriality, the true materiality, organic and non-organic materiality of the body, and you take it for a account, you will have a very different conceptuality of body, hence human agency, hence subjectivity, hence intersubjectivity, hence social world. And so that's my hope, that this is the body will be the key. When it comes to understand subjectivity as time and matter, then the body will be the key to this. And I think it will, I hope it will shed new lights on all these issues. But at the moment, I'm not there. So the virtual issue, yeah, it's you know what bothers me or what concerns me from this point of view is always that even the virtual needs to have material kind of you know artificial technological.
It's not described. That's the problem. I mean, it's kind of described, but yeah, then again, it's need to be described and observed.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, but in this sense, I have no problem by claiming that virtuality is not materiality. You know, I'm not saying that everything is material. Consciousness is not material, certainly, but consciousness that doesn't age, doesn't have material configurations. Therefore, each temporal structure is completely different than because it's reversible, in opposition to the material temporality, which is irreversible. But for me, it's not a problem to say that there are not material things. Obviously, you can ask what
history.
Sorry?
That are constitutive for history, because these immaterial cognitive stuff will determine history to a degree.
No. Yes, no. Yeah, I'm not saying that consciousness is not historical consciousness is not an essential factor to constituting history. In the same way, virtuality can also be. All I'm saying is that there is another side of history. You cannot reduce history and historicity simply to the formation of historical consciousness. But yes, you can ask the question, what is the relationship between the two? Because doesn't it lead to mind-body kind of distinction of very classic type, you know? It seems to me that precisely the question of will be the temporality. The temporality that would relay, because you have consciousness, you have matter. Maybe they might be distinct at the time, reversible time, irreversible time, make them, make at least a bridge between these two structures. Yeah, that's an ontological question too, that but I think temporality will allow me to bridge these two levels if I get there once. So I don't know if I'll be able to, but definitely want to say something about social constitutions, social configurations from this materialist point of view if I have the success and the chance to do that.
Okay, Georgia.
Thank you. I was thinking how you. That is just a suggestion because I think it's more than an example. There is a romantic literature that talks about the relation between non-human and human, and so there's a lot of poetry that actually dating to the 19th century already has thought about this centering the human and everything. My question has to do, and it's very short, the unthought that I thought of your article and what we're describing here is the question of language. So what happens to language when all of this is done? I mean, what happens to the materiality of language, and how do we need a new philosophy of language that, or do we work without a tradition? And my second question has to do. So you speak about human subjects, subjectivity, which is kind of sounds like new humanism. My question is, what would happen with the question of humanness? And I'm asking this from an anti-humanist perspective. So how would the question of humanness be posed again, and what would that mean?
Yeah. Shall I? Wait for a moment.
In the article we are speaking about today, Professor Takács, you are reflecting on the question of relation between temporality and materiality. And I would like to notice that it seems to me, in your approach to the phenomenon of historicity, the topic of space has somehow been neglected in the article, but not in the lecture. In the philosophies of transcendental phenomenology, there is a general primacy of temporality over spatiality regarding the problem of constitution of human reality. In other words, the category of time is seen as more significant than the category of space in the transcendentally grounded phenomenological projects. At the same time, while the project of phenomenology and philosophy was constructed in Germany, in France, a call des annales was developing in the field of historiography. Lucien Febvre, which you mentioned in his Introduction géographique à l'histoire, published in 1922, proved that geography cannot be seen just as a mere stage, as a theater for historical events to take place, but that their relation is much more complex. And I would like to ask you, can we also talk about speciality and not only temporality as the original horizon on which the phenomena of historicity manifest themselves, or about space or particular place as material ground for historical meaning formations? What do you think? And my other question, concurrently with Lucien Febvre's working on mentioned book, Jose Ortega y Gasset spoke about something he called topographical reason, raison topographica. And can we radicalize this concept of Ortega y Gasset, make a step forward and speak about topological reason? I am aware that you, Professor Takács, used elsewhere the term topological, the concept of topology in your work. So could you please clarify your position in regards to this issue in the light of the realist philosophy of world and life?
Yes, thank you. This is very crucial. Well, I'll start with this right away. I mean, yes, it's true. I didn't address the question of space. But my reason was that that's the mainstream approach to this whole question. So when it comes to analyze matter and body, that's the classic phenomenological gesture and classic philosophical gesture. Then you talk about space and the end of story. So we do have 2-3 handful theories, except in fact we have but that to analyze the topological or the spatial configuration of materiality. The reason I didn't address this question because precisely I wanted to ask the question of time, because that's what really unusual. At the same time, obviously well aware that these questions are not separable from one another, and the best accounts of the temporality of matter are usually those theories that also accounts for the spatiality of this temporality. So the spacing of the temporality, like Derrida's material structure of the trace, precisely the becoming of time into space and becoming space into time. So I'm not at these so far. I'm not dealing with the question of space because again, this is the question of strategy and the project that I'm awaiting to arrive to conclusive results about the notion of time, and then see in what way does it confirms or forces to realter those theories of space that has been developed within the phenomenological tradition, and what way the discoveries about the materiality of time or the temporality of matter alters these notions. That will come at the second stage. So far, it seems to me that I can get away without addressing this question frontally. Then, what is the spatial dimension? But obviously, the historicity issue brings it into the fore. All the archaeological kind of references I made. That's also always and ineluctably leads to the question of spatiality. It just seems to me that if you want to understand the notion of time and relation of time and matter, you need to kind of artificially cut this problem out of a larger context and analyze them on their own level. That's more useful than putting every big major ontological category into the same analytic and try to analyze them or understand them at the same time. So it's a question of order and a question of privilege in this level. But it's true that so far you have far less theories of material time than theories of matter and space. So that's the issue. But yes, I'm well aware, both the question of nature, both the cosmological dimension, both of the question of body is evidently and immediately calls for a clarification of the spatial sense.
Spatial being in the world.
Yeah, exactly. But again, what I'm saying, this is a mainstream interpretation from Husserl through Heidegger through Merleau-Ponty. So it's they talk infinitely about the spatiality of body. In fact, the body is the organ, phenomenological organ that constitutes space, according to mainstream classical phenomenological theories. And I think this kind of striking that they never ask the question of, okay, but what about the temporality of the body? So yeah, so what does it mean that body does it? And the answer is no. The body receives the temporality from the consciousness. You know, so it's as simple as that.
The body is aging, as you said.
Exactly. So only Max Scheler, the only one who among this generation asked the question of the aging. But even Scheler claims that only organic entities age. Things don't age according to that. Thing don't age. Inorganic things don't age according to Scheler. So that's about the question of space. As far as the question of humanity is concerned, I can give the same answer that I give to the question of human agency. So I think, as I see it, if this project that I'm doing about temporality and different levels and layers of temporality connected to different levels of materiality will lead to the dismantling of the notion of human agency or human being as such. And you will have different facets and assets of which you can still call human, but in very different and sometimes irreconcilable or contradictory sense. So there's not one human agent, one human being. Your body brings about or carries with itself these three different, radically different sense of what human is. And I think to account for the humanity or the human being from that point of view can lead to understand very differently of social and intersubjective relations too. So that's my answer. I think it will be not an anti-humanist or anti-subjectivist position, but it will be directed very clearly against the one single unity that we could call human as such. And instead it will be arguing for nuanced and detailed and, if you wish, dismantled understanding of human life and human world and human subject. Now, as far as the question of language is concerned, of course, this is a major issue here. But I don't. My problem is not the language and matter. My problem is meaning and matter. And I think it's language is an articulated meaning. But meaning doesn't necessarily have to be articulated to mean, to make, to experience doesn't have to be articulated, linguistically, to make sense. That's a basic phenomenological discovery that you have meaning formation, even without articulating it in a linguistic form. At the same time, linguistic articulation needs material medium, paper or voice. These are material factors that are temporalized and spatialized, and that's how you can go to linguistic articulation. So I would be quite dependent of the linguistic articulation, the fact of language, on all these meaning formations and the material processes that they presuppose. So for me, the question of language is really a remote question. I think there are much more to do in the order of ontological clarification, starting with Kristava's project of material processes and signifying processes and the relationship. Before you can go and ask the question of the status of language and linguistic articulation. I don't know if I'm going to get there ever, because it's in the order of the problematic, it seems quite remote, and the meaning, I think, meaning formation precedes by any manner the question of language and communication. So that would be my short answer to your question.
Okay, that's all. Any more questions to Ádám or comments? Okay, thank you very much for being so dynamic.